Chapter 40. One Strength in Numbers. Sonny was sprawled in the mud, looking at the sky. He didn't even have to catch his breath since the whole fight took less than 10 seconds from start to finish. No one was dead, wounded, or even bruised well, with the exception of the scavenger. It was completely out of his expectations. He glanced at the monster's corpse to make sure that it was actually dead, then summoned the runes and took a look at the number of shadow fragments in his possession. Shadow fragments, 1000. It was actually true. The mighty awakened beast perished just like that, and although Nephi's did most of the work, he was the one to deal the killing blow. Why can't it always be so easy? Sonny got back on his feet and dismissed the azure blade. Then, he remembered the words Master Jet had once told him. No one can survive in the dream realm alone. Back then, he noted her advice, but didn't really believe it. After all, he had always strived to be self-sufficient, not allowing himself to depend on anyone. In Sonny's mind, this was the true meaning of strength. However, now he was beginning to suspect that this logic was flawed. Indeed, having someone to share your burdens meant the difference between heaven and hell here in the dream realm. If he was alone, fighting against a single scavenger might have been the end of him. Similarly, even though Nephi's was far more skilled than Sonny, it would have been extremely hard for her to defeat the armored monster alone, being that its weakest point was out of her reach. But together, they had accomplished it with relative ease. The whole was greater than the sum of the parts. In other words, there was strength in numbers that surpassed individual power. In that sense, being able to depend on a group was not a sign of weakness, but on the contrary, an important facet of personal strength. Lone wolves would always be at a disadvantage. That was another lesson to learn. It's not like I had much of a choice. He walked over to Nephi's and checked if she was okay. Apart from slight damage to her makeshift seaweed clothes, everything seemed to be all right. She glanced at Sonny. Memory. He shook his head. Nephi sighed. It seemed that she was a bit impatient to get herself a suit of armor of her own. If Sonny was a gentleman, he would have suggested to loan her the puppeteer's shroud for a while, but alas, he was. That armor was extremely valuable and had cost him a lot. Plus, unlike Changing Star, the picture of Sonny wearing nothing but a seaweed loincloth would have been more disturbing than aesthetically pleasing. So, he said nothing. Meanwhile, Nephi's headed for the dead scavenger and said without turning her head, "Bring Cassie." With a sigh, Sonny turned around and left the clearing. Soon, he approached the place where the blind girl was waiting patiently for their return. Hearing his footsteps, she flinched and raised her head. Sonny. How did she recognize me? Must be the way I walk. Yeah, it's me. Everything is over. Come on, I'll bring you to Nephi's. Using the wooden staff, Cassie stood up and turned to him. Are you guys all right? Sonny smiled. Of course. We dispatched that critter in no time. Didn't even get a scratch. Cassie smiled with visible relief. Good, that's good. Oh, right, the rope. Sonny took the rope and guided the blind girl back to the clearing. On the way, he felt a bit weird. With the delicate girl walking behind him, he couldn't help but think of his little sister. As a toddler, she used to follow him around too, as though they were glued together. As the familiar pain stabbed him in the heart, Sonny gritted his teeth and tried to think about something else. It was all in the past anyway. Back in the clearing, Nephi's was done breaking apart the scavenger's carapace. The shimmering soul shard was already in her hand. Without saying anything, she tossed it to Sonny. He caught the crystal and looked at her with surprise. Why are you giving it to me? Nephi's blinked and stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then she said as a matter of fact, I don't have pockets. Oh. Still a bit bewildered, Sonny put the soul shard into his rucksack. But why wouldn't she just absorb it? He opened his mouth to ask the question, but she seemed to realize something and added, We'll divide the spoils later. All right. Nephi's, meanwhile, turned to Cassie and said after some deliberation, I was careful. Then she smiled. Your shadow grows stronger. Your shadow grows stronger. Your shadow grows stronger. Sunny was feeling somewhere in between of being ecstatic and peeved. Throughout the day, they managed to kill 3 more scavengers, each time with not much risk to anyone except for Nephi's. The process was largely the same. After discovering the monster, he would hide in the shadows, while Nephi's would act as bait. Then, when the time was right, Sunny would stealthily approach and finish the fight with a precise strike of the azure blade. He was wondering if that was what being in the main hero's party felt like. To anyone else, maybe with the exception of Castor, dancing around a deadly awakened beast would have been a tall task, most likely ending with the dancer's death. Nephi's, however, had managed to do it over and over again seemingly without too much strain. What's more, her performance was based solely on skill, with no aspect ability involved. In that regard, even Castor couldn't have done better. She was swift, calm, and precise. Every move she made was calculated and perfectly timed. She seemed to innately understand the flow and logic of combat, which gave her the ability to roughly predict what actions the mindless beasts would perform in the next seconds. Then it was just the question of physical prowess to evade and even manipulate them to a certain degree. Sunny had always known that skill and experience were more important than raw power, but by watching Nephi's, he vividly understood just how vast the difference between them was. Even though his divine aspect allowed Sunny to exert more strength and speed than Changing Star, in an actual fight, he would never stand a chance. Of course, he was also an important part of every encounter. His role as the finisher was not trivial, and not just anybody would have been able to accomplish 4 kills with 4 strikes. Even though Sunny was not taught any elaborate techniques, he was still a somewhat experienced fighter. He had good physical coordination, combat intuition, and most importantly, a cool-headed mentality. Not to mention the fact that they were only able to ambush the scavengers so effectively due to his shadow scouting them out in advance. All in all, it was an almost equal cooperation. Still, watching Nephi's fight was nothing short of sobering. Trying not to get too dejected, Sunny summoned the runes. Shadow fragments, 22-1000. 8 fragments today, pretty excellent. Currently, they were waiting on the edge of the labyrinth path leading directly to the giant statue of the Headless Knight. There was a group of scavengers between them and the statue, moving past without any haste. The sunset was near, but they still had time. Slowly, minutes flowed by. At some point, Nephi's gave the command to move. Helping Cassie along, Sunny followed Changing Star and quickly traversed the open space between the labyrinth and the statue. Now, they only had to get on top of it. However, it wasn't that easy. Scaling the 200-meter-tall monument would have been hard in normal circumstances, but now they also had to somehow pull Cassie up. Leaving her behind until they were at the top would not have been safe. In the end, Nephi's and Sunny took turns pulling the rope every 20 meters or so. Cassie would hold onto the rocks and wait until they climbed higher, and then the process would repeat. It was slow and torturous, and by the end, Sunny's muscles were sore and almost on fire. But they managed to get to safety before the dark waters washed them away. As the night began to descend, the 3 sleepers sat in the center of the circular stone platform and rested. As they did not bring any materials to make a fire and it was already too late, there was no way to cook food. They ended up chewing on the strips of dried meat, passing the bottle of limitless water around. After some time, Nephi's gave Sunny a sign to take out the spoils of today's journey. He took out the 4 shimmering soul shards and put them on the ground. Without any discussion, Changing Star moved 2 crystals in his direction and took 2 for herself. Then, she gave one of hers to Kasha. Sunny watched it in silence. By the time Nephi's and Cassie had absorbed their soul shards, he still didn't make a move to take his. After a while, he took another crystal out of the rucksack and moved all 3 to Nephi's. The silver-haired girl looked at him with surprise. "Don't you want to grow stronger?" Sunny grinned. "Of course I do, but these won't do me much good right now. It's no secret that you are the main fighting force of our group." He sighed. "The stronger you are, the better our chances of survival will get. Plus, it's not a gift, it's a trade. Nephi's raised an eyebrow. A trade, what do you want? Sunny deliberated for a few seconds before answering. It's rather simple. I will give you these soul shards, and all other soul shards I earn on the way to that castle. Then he looked her in the eyes and said, in return, you will teach me how to fight. Chapter 42, Essence of Combat. Nephis looked at him and contemplated. This time, she remained silent longer than usual. Sunny felt a bit nervous under her gaze, knowing that he was being evaluated. With Changing Star's skill and insight, it wasn't hard to imagine just how much she had gleaned from his battle performance. Both his current level and future potential must have been pretty much laid bare in front of her. Were they enough to make teaching him worth her while? After some time, she took the soul shards and nodded. Okay. Sunny smiled, congratulating himself on a successful deal. Not only did he receive a lot while not losing much, but he had also managed to create a bit of a favorable impression of himself in the eyes of Nephis and Cassie. As far as performances went, this was a great one. So when do we start? Nephis shrugged. Now. Now. Sunny glanced at the sun, which was already almost gone. Were they going to train in complete darkness? It wasn't really an obstacle for him. Changing Star, however. We will start with some words. That will be enough for today. After hesitating a little, she added, Cassie, you listen too. Sunny and Kasha turned to Nephis, listening to her like two obedient students. Despite the fact that their age was more or less similar, both knew that, in terms of martial prowess, their companion had authority that was as beyond theirs as a dragon's might was beyond that of a worm. Nephis thought for a while and then said, Mastery of combat can be divided into two aspects. One is body, and the other one is mind. Training the body is not easy, but it is rather simple. All you need is repetition and experience. In a fight, things happen too fast to consider every detail in the moment. That's why your technique must exist in your muscles and bones, so much so that it almost becomes an instinct. She paused. You can achieve initial results through repetition. Then, it must be cemented through experience. The more battle experience you have, the deeper a technique will be assimilated into your body. There is no other way. 1,000 hours of training won't be as impactful as one real fight. Only those who survive countless battles can be truly in command of the body. That simultaneously made a lot of sense and no sense at all. On the one hand, the principle of improving through practice was quite logical. On the other hand, Changing Star's statement made it seem like all those lofty legacies with their years of training were nothing but harmless children. After all, no matter how good their tutors were, they had no real battle experience. But then again, she did wipe the floor with every one of them, excluding Castor, with no apparent difficulty. So maybe her statement was true. That, however, posed a question of its own. Just what kind of life had Nephis led to possess rich battle experience at the tender age of 18? Should I stop calling her princess? Meanwhile, Nephis continued. Training the mind, however, is not simple at all. That is because, once you reach a certain level of skill, the mind is where the true combat takes place. The outcome is often decided before your body begins to move. And to master the mind, the first step is to understand the essence of combat. However, very few people truly do. She looked at them and asked, What do you think that essence is? Sunny hesitated. The essence of combat, what might it be? If it was some other legacy, he would have been tempted to say something stupid like honor, valor, or duty. But he already knew that Nephis did not fit into the image of a noble aristocrat he had in his mind. She wasn't someone who followed empty words. After a minute or so, Cassie finally answered. Victory. And almost at the same time, Sunny said, Survival. Changing Star shook her head. No. Then she rubbed her neck and pierced them with a cold, fierce gaze. The essence of combat is murder. Cassie flinched and opened her eyes wide. Sunny frowned a little. Nephis, however, did not seem to care. In the same calm tone, she continued. At the core of it, there is only this. You are trying to kill your opponent, and they are trying to kill you. In the end, one of you will be killed, and the other one will be the killer. Everything else is just noise. Her words sank deep into Sonny's heart and reverberated there, causing something inside of him to resonate and awaken. Style doesn't matter. Weapons don't matter. Reason and intent do not matter. The only thing that matters is to be the last one standing. In this way, anything you do in combat must be viewed as only serving one of two purposes, either to kill your enemy or to prevent the enemy from killing you. Nephise lowered her eyes. If you can understand that, you will have enough clarity to master the mind. After that, Sonny couldn't fall asleep for a long while. He lay on the cold stone, looking into the darkness and thinking about what Nephise had taught them. Repetition, experience, clarity. These were the 3 keys to becoming a fearsome warrior. All 3 were important, but the last one was the most vexing. Was it really how Changing Star had said? Was there nothing at the core of being a warrior than a cold will to kill? Intuitively, he felt that it was indeed so. This ruthless truth was, in a sense, an amalgamation of all his life experiences. After all, for someone like him, life was nothing but a constant battle for survival. Someone always won, and someone always lost. The former got to live for a few more days. The latter, no one cared what happened to them. Of course, life was life, and combat was combat. To most people, they weren't one and the same. But what about the awakened? The sole purpose of their existence was to fight against the nightmare creatures. Very few could escape that fate. After coming to the academy, Sonny allowed himself to think that he had escaped the fate of always having to struggle at the edge of survival. But now, it seemed like he had just exchanged one battle for another. This was an uncomfortable thought. However, if he looked at it from a different perspective, did it actually mean that he always had a crucial advantage? Most of those chosen by the spell were forced to somehow adjust to this merciless way of life. But he had always lived like this. Was he actually one of the few perfectly suited to be an awakened? With this thought, Sonny fell asleep. In the early morning, he was awakened by a piercing scream. Chapter 43, Repetition. Sonny was on his feet even before fully waking up. Somehow, Azure Blade was already in his hand. His shadow was hovering beside him, ready to either wrap itself around the sword in case he needed to attack or around his body, in case it was already too late for that. He tried to understand what was going on. Nephise was nearby, her longsword raised in a defensive stance. Cassie. Where is Cassie? Fearing what he might see, giant tentacles reaching for them from the darkness, he looked around. The eastern horizon was just beginning to show the first hints of dawn, adding a tiny shade of gray to the blackness of the world. In that blackness, there were no signs of danger. Finally, he saw Cassie. The blind girl was stumbling at the edge of the platform with a horrified expression on her face. With her blonde hair in a mess, she was stretching her hands out, clearly lost in space. Of course, there were no walls for her to find. The platform was open to the elements, and the only thing waiting for Cassie was a plunge into the dark, tumultuous waters. Before Sonny knew what he was doing, he was already running. That wasn't a very smart thing to do, after all. He did not know what had caused Kasha to scream, and if there was some hidden danger nearby. Plus, it was still too dark for Nephise to see. His sudden lunge could have caused her to lash out with the sword before asking questions. All of these were good reasons to wait and observe first, but in an uncharacteristic and completely irrational manner, Sonny acted before thinking. He caught Cassie moments before she took a step off the platform, and holding her tightly in his arms, dragged the blind girl back. "I got her," Sonny yelled, letting Changing Star know that there was no need to stab him with a sword. And then, in a quiet voice, he said to Cassie, "I got you. It's all right. Everything is fine. Calm down." He felt the girl's body trembling and looked around again, trying to understand what had scared her so much. But there was nothing. Nephise was listening to the sea for the same reason. After a few seconds, she asked, "Do you see anything?" Sonny helplessly shook his head. "No." He helped Cassie sit down in the center of the platform. While Nephis stood guard above them, he looked the blind girl over to make sure that there were no wounds on her body. Everything seemed to be fine. She's not hurt anywhere. Changing Star looked down. Although her face remained indifferent, he could tell that she was a bit flustered. After a second or two, she asked in something that might have been her version of a calming tone. It sounded pretty much exactly the same as usual. "Cassie, what happened?" Magically, that did seem to calm the blind girl down a little, at least enough for her to speak in a quivering voice. Cassie extended one hand and pointed down. The head I saw, oh gods." Sunny frowned and looked at Nephis. Did she see a vision, the past? The tall girl was silent for a moment. I don't know, it never happened before. Both of them turned to Cassie, not sure what to do. Since there was no apparent danger around, they took turns trying to calm the horrified girl down. However, after that one sentence, she fell quiet and refused to speak again. Nothing seemed to help. After a while, Nephis sighed. Let's leave her be for now. Maybe she needs time. Sunny was about to retort, but truth be told, he didn't have any ideas either. In the end, he just nodded. Okay, I'll keep an eye on her. Changing Star, however, had other ideas. As the sun was rising and the surging sea was receding, Nephis chose to give Cassie some space and led Sunny to the edge of the platform. However, she made sure to always have the blind girl in the periphery of her vision. Kasia sat hugging her knees. Her eyes were closed, but small tremors that periodically ran through her body betrayed that she was awake. Sunny's eye twitched. Are you sure it's okay to leave her like this? Nephis gave him a complicated look. Yes. Then, after some thought, she added, Cassie is strong. Sunny wasn't sure how to answer. If Changing Star considered someone to be strong, then they most likely were. However, strong was the last word that came to his mind when he thought about the delicate, beautiful, blind girl. Wasn't she someone who constantly needed their help? But then again, there were different kinds of strength. Kasia was still alive and sane despite her debilitating flaw. How many people could have done the same? If you say so. Then Nephis made him summon the azure blade. After studying it for a while, she nodded and took her longsword out of the air. Despite its size, it was an elegant weapon. The narrow, double-edged blade was much longer than that of the azure blade, with an incredibly sharp, symmetrical tip. The whole blade, as well as the simple cross-shaped guard and the pommel, seemed to be made out of silver and reflected the pale morning light. The handle was tightly wrapped in black leather. Putting the two swords side by side, Nephis spoke. Your sword can be used with one hand, but its true potential can only be revealed when held in both. It is created primarily for cutting and severing, hence the higher center of gravity. However, it can thrust as well. Then she gestured to hers. My sword is a bit more versatile. It is created for both cutting and thrusting, and it has a double edge. However, the principle of wielding these two swords is the same. She took the sword in both hands, placing one near the guard and another near the pommel. Then, she performed a downward slash. They are both leverage-based weapons. When held with two hands, one hand pushes. She pushed the sword down with the hand near the guard, while the other hand pulls. The hand near the pommel simultaneously pulled the handle up, giving the blade a tremendous boost in speed. This is how you generate force and perform powerful strikes. Now, your turn. Sunny looked at his sword and gripped it with both hands, mimicking Nephis's pose. Then, he raised it and slashed down, making sure to enhance the force of the strike with his lower hand. Changing Star observed him. You need to understand that a strike doesn't come from the hands. It comes from your whole body. Power comes from your feet, your hips, your core, your shoulders, and is only then transmitted to your hands. Like this. She demonstrated the downward slash again. This time, Sunny paid attention to the overall stance and movements of every part of Changing Star's body, as opposed to only the sword. He wasn't a novice to fighting. Instinctively, he already knew how to deliver a proper punch, even if, before, there wasn't a lot of strength in his body. The principles of striking with a sword were largely the same, so Sunny quickly understood the overall concept. He performed the simple downward slash a few more times. After each time, Nephi's gave him pointers and corrected his mistakes. Some time later, she was finally satisfied with his form. Good. Sunny smiled, proud of his achievements. Nephi's looked at him thoughtfully and nodded. Now, do it 1,000 more times. The smile froze on Sunny's face. 1,000. Did she say 1,000? He blinked. Sorry, how many times? Changing Star tilted her head and thought for some time. Well, we don't have much time today, so yes, only 1,000. Ha ha ha, only 1,000, eh? Sunny forced himself to sound polite. I see, all right. As Nephi's walked back to sit with Cassie, he turned to the sea and raised his sword. 1. The azure blade whistled as it cut the air. He raised it again. 2. Push and pull. This is how you generate force. 3. Strike with your whole body, not just your hands. 4. As Sunny raised his sword and slashed down, over and over again, only one thought eventually remained in his mind. Repetition, experience clarity, repetition. By the time he was done performing 1,000 strikes, Cassie was finally ready to speak. Chapter 40, For Cassie's Dream. With pretty much every muscle in his body sore, Sunny walked over to the girls and fell on the ground. After catching his breath, he looked at Kasha. Cassie, do you feel better? Several seconds later, the blind girl slowly nodded. That's a relief. He shifted and hesitated for a bit. Kasha didn't look too well. Her face was still very pale, with a distant, dazed expression on it. Her body, at least, was no longer trembling. Sunny wasn't very good at talking to people, let alone placating them. He wasn't sure what to say. He cast a gaze at Nephi's and sighed inwardly. Who knew that one day he would turn out to be the most sociable person for as far as the eye could see? What a joke. Can I have some water? Cassie turned to him and scowled, as though confused by the question. Then, she suddenly gasped and opened her eyes wide. Oh, sorry. Yes, of course. She summoned the limitless water bottle and offered it to Sunny. He took it with a grateful smile and greedily drank a few gulps before giving the bottle to Nephi's. Eventually, it returned to Cassie. You drink some too. After she did, he awkwardly patted the blind girl on the shoulder. Everything seems to be fine now. Did you dream of another vision? You can tell us, if you want. Cassie hesitated for a bit before saying, I don't know. Maybe it was just a nightmare. Sunny and Nephi's exchanged glances. They both doubted that what Cassie saw was a simple nightmare. After all, people usually did not dream in the dream realm. The blind girl, meanwhile, continued. I don't really remember. It's all in fragments. Sunny carefully considered his words, not wanting to pressure Cassie too much. You can just tell us what you remember. Maybe we'll be able to make sense of it together. Kasha sighed and tentatively nodded. After a long pause, she finally found the courage to speak. At first, I saw the boundless darkness locked behind 7 seals. Something vast was churning in the darkness. I felt like if I directly saw it, I would lose my mind. As I watched, terrified, the seals broke one after another until only one remained. And then that seal broke, too. She trembled a little. After that, I don't know. It was as though my mind shattered into 1,000 shards, each shard reflecting its own image. Most of them were dark and scary. Some I have already forgotten. The other. Cassie fell silent, remembering. I saw the human castle again. Only this time it was at night. There was a lonely star burning in the black skies, and under its light, the castle was suddenly consumed by fire, with rivers of blood flowing down its halls. I saw a corpse in a golden armor sitting on a throne, a woman with a bronze spear drowning in a tide of monsters, an archer trying to pierce the falling sky with his arrows. Finally, she looked up, her face full of horror. In the end, I saw a colossal, terrifying crimson spire. At its base, 7 severed heads were guarding 7 locks. And at the top, a dying angel was being consumed by hungry shadows. When I saw the angel bleed, I suddenly felt as though something so precious that it can't be described with words was taken from me. Her voice became quieter. Then, I felt so much sorrow, pain, and rage that what little remained of my sanity seemed to disappear. That was when I woke up, I think. Nephi's and Sunny remained silent for a while, trying to make sense of what Cassie had told them. Even if Nephi's had an idea, she didn't show it. Sunny, however, was totally lost. He couldn't even begin to decipher the hidden meaning behind the vision, if it even was one. Previously, Cassia's vision about the castle was pretty much straightforward. It showed her a human fortress and even the direction in which it was situated. This time, however, her dream was disjointed, full of weird symbolism and vague, uncertain images, much more like a charlatan's prophecy than a vision gained through an aspect ability. Finally, he sighed. Maybe it actually was just a nightmare. Your previous visions weren't like this, right? Cassie silently shook her head. Sunny scratched the back of his head. Well, people don't usually dream in the dream realm, but you do. Perhaps seeing a random nightmare once in a while is a side effect of your ability. The blind girl turned to him, a faint relief written on her face. You really think so? He hesitated, trying to find the right words. Why not? It's a possibility. Inwardly, however, he felt uneasy. A dying angel being consumed by shadows? Why does it sound so ominous? I should try and stay away from angels in the future. Gee, what has become of my life? A sentence like that doesn't even sound insane anymore. With that, they were finally ready to welcome a new day. Some time later, they were sitting on the western edge of the stone platform, looking at the scavengers below. Sunny's shadow was busy scouting a path to the next high landmark. Were there always that many? Sunny glanced at Nephi's and shook his head. No, there were much more. They seem to be almost done with the carcass. I doubt it will last until nightfall. Which meant that, by tomorrow, all these beasts would be roaming the labyrinth, making it hard for the 3 sleepers to make any progress. It would be best to leave today and put some distance between themselves and the horde before the scavengers were done with their feast. However, without scouting a path in advance, there was a chance of not making it to safety in time. Both options were risky. Nephi's frowned, seemingly thinking the same. After a while, she said, I don't want Cassie to spend another night near this statue. Let's leave now. Sunny thought for a while, then opened his mouth to offer his own opinion. However, a sudden commotion below prevented him from speaking. Down at the bottom of the disappearing sea, amidst mounds of broken coral, the carcass of the giant shark-like monster, the remaining half of it, to be precise, was almost stripped of meat. And between its white bones, something was shimmering in the mud. 2 extremely large, luminescent crystals. Sunny's eyes widened. Are those? Yes, shards of 2 transcendent soul cores. Transcendent, 2 of them. Suddenly, he was simultaneously filled with greed and fear. Greed because of how rare and precious transcendent soul shards were. Fear because the giant shark turned to be a corrupted devil, at least. One corrupted devil, if not stopped by a saint or a large number of awakened, could potentially destroy an entire city. Sunny belatedly realized that he was much closer to death on that first night than he had previously thought. Should we wait and listen? He stared at Nephi's and then obediently listened to the distant, barely audible clamor of the scavengers. After a while, he noticed some disharmony in it. Nephi's suddenly tensed up. There. She pointed in the direction of the labyrinth. After concentrating on it, Sunny was finally able to notice 2 massive shadows stepping out of a particularly wide passage. A second later, the creatures casting those shadows appeared in sight. Sunny gulped. Damn. The monsters looked like the scavengers, but not quite. To start with, they were much larger, towering above the surroundings at more than 3 meters of height. Their carapace seemed to be thicker. It was colored in deep black and scarlet, like an ancient armor drenched in blood. Here and there, vicious-looking spikes were growing out of the carapace, making their every move much more dangerous. Additionally, instead of heavy pincers, their upper arms ended with long, curved, terrifying bone scythes. Sunny felt cold sweat running down his spine. What the hell are those things? Nephise tilted her head. Monsters, I guess. Nightmare creatures with one soul core were called beasts. They were dangerous and strong, but mindless. If they were able to develop or were created with a second core, they became monsters. Monsters were much more devastating and possessed some rudimentary, warped form of intelligence. They were the next step in a nightmare beast's evolution. And these too seemed to be bigger, deadlier versions of carapace scavengers. Sunny and Nephise watched as the two monsters approached the carcass. The scavengers were visibly afraid of them, rushing to get out of the way. Those who were too slow were mercilessly thrown to the side or cut apart by the bone scythes. Rivers of azure blood were flowing into the mud. What are they doing? Did they come to absorb the soul shards? Finally, the monsters reached the carcass. Each of them took one of the shards. However, instead of absorbing them, they simply turned around and carried the precious crystals away. The scavengers made way, following the shards with their little, hungry eyes. Sunny blinked and looked at Nephise. Do we still leave now? Changing Star frowned and hesitated. A few moments later, she shook her head. No, we'll go tomorrow. Then, she turned west and observed the retreating monsters. Get your shadow to follow these two back. Chapter 40, 5 Sound of Laughter. Because of the shadow fragments Sunny had absorbed in the last few days, the range of shadow control has increased a little. However, it was still far from being enough to explore deep into the labyrinth. He only got the general direction in which the two large monsters were moving. They were going west. After telling this to Nephise, there was pretty much nothing else for him to do. In the end, Sunny decided to simply rest. The next day was promising to be full of hardships and danger, so it was in his best interest to let his body recover as much as it could. Sometime later, Sunny was lying on his back, staring at the gray sky. Cassie was sitting beside him, lost in her thoughts. Nephise was meditating. At least, that's what it looked like. She might as well have been asleep for all Sunny knew. After a while, Cassie turned to him. Sunny. He tilted his head to look at her. Yeah. The blind girl hesitated. Do you think we'll be able to return home? Sunny glanced at her and furrowed his brow. A few seconds later, he turned away and looked at the sky again. Sure. Cassie smiled. You really think so? Why? What's with all these questions? He sighed and tried to find the right words. Because of her. He pointed at Nephise, knowing that Cassie won't see it. There was no one else on the stone platform, though, so it was pretty obvious who he was referring to. I'm also not someone to die easily. In fact, I'm willing to bet that you couldn't have found a better duo of sleepers to escort you across the dream realm. If anyone can survive this, it's us. So, yeah, I think that our chances of making it back are pretty high. Cassie suddenly giggled. Aren't you a little too full of yourself? You were in the second to last place. Sunny shrugged. That's only because someone smart told me to keep a low profile. Otherwise, I would have ranked higher. Then, with a grin, he added. Much higher, third to last at least. The blind girl couldn't help but laugh. The melodic sound of her laughter made Sunny feel much better. He had not heard anything like that ever since coming to the dream realm. It was nice to see that people were still able to preserve a bit of mirth even in this hellish place. Come to think of it, this was the first time he heard Cassie laugh at all. Back in the academy, she was always dull and bleak. After this sudden outburst, Cash's expression slowly turned wistful. A few seconds later, she asked, What do you miss the most about home? Sunny tried to think of something, but failed. He wasn't sure that he even had a home in the real world. The tiny room he had been renting previously was nothing but a temporary shelter from the rain. As for the real world as a whole, his life there wasn't that pleasant either. Finally, he said, I don't particularly miss anything. Cassie was very surprised. Really? Don't you miss your family? Sunny smiled. I don't have a family. Well, I guess I have a sister somewhere, but we haven't seen each other in many years. Oh. The blind girl fell silent. Several seconds later, she said quietly, I miss my family the most. There was longing and sadness in her voice. Sunny didn't know what to say, so he stayed silent. Mom and Dad must be really worried about me right now. No, actually, they wouldn't be worried. They would be heartbroken. They must think that I'm as well as dead already. Sunny glanced at her and sighed. You seem to care about them a lot. Cassie turned to him in confusion. Of course, isn't it normal? Sunny stared at the gray sky. The wind smelled of rain. After a while, he said, I wouldn't know. In the evening, Nephi's made Sunny perform the 1,000 strikes again. After that, they ate the last strips of dried scavenger meat and took turns sleeping, so that one of them could always keep an eye on Cassie. Thankfully, nothing happened during the night. When the morning came and the dark sea retreated, they prepared to leave the giant statue. Nephi's was the first one to climb down. Before that, she had a few words to say. Today will be different from before. There will be much more scavengers roaming in the labyrinth. We might not be able to create an ambush or avoid fighting several of them at once. She looked at Sunny. If anything happens, your job is to bring Cassie away. We can retreat by using passages that are too narrow for the scavengers. If we get separated, proceed to the high point by yourselves. Don't wait for me. Do you understand? With a somber expression, he gave her a nod. Nephi's returned it. Good. Time is of the essence, so let's go. With that, she began the descent. After Nephi's reached a point 20 or so meters below them, she found purchase and waited. Using the golden rope, Sunny lowered Cassie down. Just like while climbing up, they took turns helping the blind girl. Luckily, climbing down the statue was much easier. Soon, they reached the ground. Entering the labyrinth, the trio moved forward with haste. The shadow was ahead of them, scouting for monsters and optimal paths. Despite that, their progress was slow and chaotic. They had to constantly change direction to avoid groups of scavengers, often ending up in dead ends or moving further away from their destination. Sunny, who played the role of the scout and navigator, felt his brains slowly starting to boil. At some point, however, they inevitably ended up in a situation where a fight was unavoidable. There was a large group of scavengers at their heels, and a pair of them blocking the path ahead. Neither of the two groups had noticed the sleepers yet. However, since there were no other passages to turn into, it was only a matter of time. Nephi's considered their options for a few seconds. There was a scowl on her face. Finally, she said, If there's only two, we can take them. Sunny looked at her, with uncertainty in his eyes. But there's no time to set up an ambush. He wasn't quite sure how they could fight two scavengers at once. Despite how good of a teacher Nephi's was, he only practiced with the sword for a day. Facing against a scavenger alone was risky. Changing Star shrugged. It's almost the same. I'll attack first. You follow behind in the shadows and finish one off once they turn. Then we kill the second one together. The whole plan was based on the assumption that Nephi's could survive under the onslaught of two scavengers, both attacking her simultaneously. Sunny was very impressed by her prowess, but he wasn't sure that it was possible. There was a large probability that Nephi's would die. He still remembered that she wasn't present in Cassie's first vision. But what else could they do? A bit rattled, Sunny gritted his teeth. All right. After a short pause, Nephi's summoned her sword. Then she stepped forward. Chapter 46 Experience. After finding a good hiding spot for Cassie, Sunny and Nephi's proceeded forward to face the scavengers. Soon, they saw two hulking silhouettes in the distance. With her lips pursed together, Nephi's threw over her shoulder. Keep up. Then, like a runner preparing for a race, she got down on one knee, inhaled deeply, and lunged forward. Damn. Sunny dove into the deep shadow cast by the wall of the labyrinth and followed, running as fast as he could. However, the distance between them kept growing. Suddenly, he remembered walking behind Nephi's as they crossed the bridge to the academy. Was it his fate to always follow behind her? Changing Star's running speed was incredibly fast. She was practically flying through the air, like an arrow let loose from a bow. One of her arms was stretched backward, holding the sword with its point to the ground. The other was cutting the air with each stride. It took the two scavengers a couple of seconds to realize what was happening after noticing her. By that time, she was almost upon them. With madness burning in their eyes and viscous saliva dripping from their mandibles, the monsters screeched and charged forward. Nephi's did not slow down, as though planning to ram them with her body. Sunny's heart skipped a bit. 4 terrifying pincers shot through the air. At the last moment, Nephi's fell backward, falling on her side. The inertia carried her forward as she slid through the mud, passing between the scavengers. Then, she twisted her body and stopped herself by plunging the sword into the ground. A bit slower, and she would have been impaled by one of the scavengers' legs. Crazy, she's crazy. By the time Changing Star got back to her feet, one of the scavengers had already turned around. However, Sunny couldn't see what was going on as his sight was blocked by the bulky carapace creatures. He only heard the sound of chitin striking against steel. There was no time to worry about that anyway, since he had his own problems to solve. Due to the insane maneuver that Nephi's had pulled off, the second scavenger lagged a little behind the first one. It was just about to turn around when Sunny finally got close enough to launch an attack. Silently cursing, he ran up a narrow protrusion on the coral wall and jumped, aiming to pierce the weak point at the scavenger's back from above. His shadow was already wrapped around the azure blade. But at the last moment, the scavenger suddenly moved, slightly turning its torso to the right. The blade missed the concave spot where the armor plates connected and instead hit one of them square in the center, sliding helplessly across adamantine chitin. Crap. Instead of killing the beast with one decisive blow, Sunny ended up dealing no damage at all. What's worse, he landed right on top of the scavenger, practically hugging it from behind. In the next moment, the scavenger shook its carapace, throwing the irritating human off. Sunny flew sideways and crashed into the labyrinth wall, feeling breath being knocked out of him. Suffocating and disoriented, he fell gracelessly into the mud. Not good. By some instinct, Sunny rolled to the side. Something tore past him and hit the wall, sending pieces of crimson coral flying through the air. Then, he was lifted into the air and thrown backward. But by that time, however, he had already come to his senses. Twisting his body, Sunny managed to land on his feet and take a few steps back without falling. In the next second, his sword was in front of him, held in both hands just like Nephi's had taught him. The scavenger was already charging at him, with a menacing fire burning in its eyes. Repetition, experience. The shadow flowed from the azure blade to his hand, then spread to his arm, shoulder, and then finally covered his whole body. Sunny instantly felt stronger, faster, more resilient. But was it enough? No. To survive, he would definitely also need some luck. One pincer flew at him from the right, the other from the left. There was no time to retreat or dodge sideways. So, instead, Sunny did something that made every instinct in his body scream in protest. He jumped forward, closing the distance to the charging monster. The pincers clashed together with a loud crack behind his back. Instinct or not, it was the only logical step. After all, the attack range of his sword was much shorter than that of the scavenger. He could only fight back by getting close. Before the beast had time to react, Sunny did what he had recently done thousands of times. His muscles moved even before his mind gave the command. With one fluid motion, he raised the sword over his head and slashed downward, pushing with one hand while pulling with the other. His whole body moved in concert to deliver a powerful blow. The azure blade whistled as it cut the air. Then, it hit the joint of one of the scavenger's front legs and cleaved right through it, severing the limb entirely. Blue blood sprayed everywhere. Sunny had less than a second to be amazed. I actually did it. But there was no time to be distracted. Due to the loss of its front leg, the scavenger lost balance for a moment, careening forward and down. However, he had 7 other legs. This wasn't going to last long. Coincidentally, though, at this exact moment, his other front leg slid in the mud, bringing the monster even further down. Sunny did not waste this chance. Taking a step forward, he thrust the azure blade up, pushing it into the scavenger's mouth. A severed mandible fell to the ground as the monster impaled itself on the sword with its own weight. The massive body of the nightmare creature convulsed before falling still. It was dead. Sunny slowly exhaled, only now feeling the pain in his chest and at the back of his head. He carefully touched it and grimaced. His hand came back wet with blood. At least I'm alive. You have slain an awakened beast, carapace scavenger. You shadow grows stronger. You have. With no time to listen to the spell, Sunny tugged on the sword to dislodge it from the monster's head and hurried to help Nephi's. However, it was too late. The other scavenger was lying in the mud, clearly dead. His limbs were still twitching, indicating that the fatal blow was delivered just moments ago. It seemed like Nephi's had managed to sever its spine by piercing the weak spot at the base of the beast's torso with her longsword. He couldn't see the silver-haired girl behind the bulky carcass. As Sunny approached it, he heard the sound of rugged, strained breathing. Then a shaky voice came from behind the scavenger. Don't come any closer." In the deathly silence of the battle's aftermath, Changing Star's voice sounded strange and subdued. Sunny suddenly felt as though someone had squeezed his heart in a fist. Steeling himself, he took another step forward. Nephi's was standing in front of the dead scavenger, trying to catch her breath after the intense fight. There was a bloody gash on her shoulder. However, it didn't look life-threatening. Sunny's attention, though, was instantly drawn to something else. It seemed that at some point during the fight, the tall girl's makeshift seaweed top came apart, leaving her naked above the waist. She was covering her chest with one arm. Behind the arm, squished, the supple fullness of her. Sunny flinched as though someone had stung him and hurriedly turned around. His face was burning. Without thinking about it, he even made his shadow look away. An awkward silence followed. After some time, Sunny forced himself to speak. Are you all right?" Nephi's was slow to answer. "Yes." Good. I'll go fetch Cassie then." "All right." Feeling as though an army of monsters was chasing him, he walked forward on stiff legs and then quickened his step, barely holding himself from running. Her fault. It's her fault. She should have communicated things clearer. Trying to get the vivid image out of his head, Sunny hurried to the place where Cassie was waiting for them. By the time they returned, Nephi's had already fixed her top and was wearing it as though nothing had happened. However, Sunny couldn't help but feel that the look she gave him was somewhat weird. "Forget it." After checking the wound on his head, Changing Star said, "It's just a bleeder, nothing serious. Tell me if you feel dizzy and nauseous or have a strong headache, though." Since Sunny had none of these symptoms, he kept quiet. Nephi's looked down at his clothes and sighed. "Memory." He opened his mouth to say no, but then fell silent. Come to think of it, when he killed the scavenger, the spell did say something else after informing him about the absorbed shadow fragments. At the time, he was too busy to pay it any attention. "Let me check." He summoned runes and quickly found the cluster representing his memories. Memories, Silver Bell, Puppeteer's Shroud, Azure Blade. Nothing new. Then what was the spell talking about? Suddenly, he noticed a new set of runes in the neighboring cluster. His eyes widened. Echoes, Carapace Scavenger. Chapter 47, Echo, it's an echo. Sunny couldn't believe his eyes. Echoes were an extremely rare type of reward that Awakened could receive after slaying nightmare creatures. Chances of getting one were very low. In the real world, an echo could be sold for an unimaginable amount of money. That's because they were much more precious than memories. Without delaying it much further, he dove into his sea of soul. There, very few things had changed. A lonely black sun was still hanging above the calm, silent waters. It was orbited by spheres of light that represented his memories. This time, there were 3 of them. Just like before, Sunny couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was stealthily moving just beyond the periphery of his vision. However, this time, he didn't pay it any attention. He wanted to see his echo. It, too, was represented by a sphere of light. However, this sphere was much larger and hovered further away from the shadow core. With a thought, he commanded it to descend. The sphere slowly floated down and touched the dark water. As Sunny came closer, walking on the surface of the sea, its radiance slowly faded away, revealing the monster contained within. A hulking, menacing carapace scavenger was calmly standing in front of him. There was no madness in its eyes, or any feeling at all, for that matter. After all, it wasn't really alive. It was just an echo. Shining runes appeared in the air around the scavenger. Echo, carapace scavenger. Echo type, beast. Echo core, awakened. Echo attributes, strong, armored. Echo description, a cursed soldier of the fallen legion. Before Sunny knew it, a wide grin appeared on his face. That scavenger was now his. It could be summoned and used to fight against his enemies, carry heavy cargo, or perform other tasks. What's more, it was a whole rank above its master, which meant that it was much stronger, more resilient and fearsome than a dreamer with a dormant core should normally possess. With this echo by their side, many things would become easier. Following an impulse, Sunny raised a hand and brushed it against cold, black chitin. He just wanted to touch his new possession. However, the moment his palm touched the scavenger, a strange thing happened. The soul of sea suddenly surged a little, and a new set of runes appeared. Transform echo into a shadow. Sunny flinched and snatched his hand back. What the hell is that about? He had never heard anything about transforming echoes into something else, let alone shadows. Then again, he had never heard about shadow cores and fragments, too. It seems my aspect holds more secrets than I thought. Sunny licked his lips and hesitated. Then he cautiously said, "Yes." However, nothing happened. A moment later, the runes changed. Not enough shadow fragments to perform a transformation. Shadow fragments required, 24,100. He frowned, disappointed. I see, so there is another use for the fragments. They can either enhance my own core or do something weird to echoes. How do I know which use is more beneficial without knowing what a transformation actually does? An echo was plenty useful by itself. Sunny felt that it would be wiser to concentrate on strengthening himself, at least for now. I'll experiment with it later. With that, he left the Sea of Soul. Since he had spaced out for quite a bit, Nephi's was looking at him with a silent question in her eyes. Sunny grinned. I got an echo. Her pupils slightly widened. Cassie, on the other hand, was more expressive. An echo? You actually got an echo? Yes. Since the larger group of monsters was now minutes away from catching up with them, Sunny didn't waste any time and summoned the scavenger. The hulking beast immediately appeared in front of him, seemingly sewn together from tiny sparks of light. Soon, its black chitin became fully corporeal. Following Sunny's command, it shifted a little and raised its mighty pincers. Nephi's observed the echo with an unreadable expression. Then, a corner of her lips slightly curled up. Good. Sunny looked at her with a smile. I think we can task it with carrying Cassie. Outside of battle, it will help us the most. The blind girl's mouth fell open. Carry me, like a mount. He chuckled and slapped the scavenger on its carapace. This bad boy can fit a petite girl like you with no problem at all. Trust me, I've been clambering these things a lot for the past few days. It's actually quite spacious on top of them, especially if they're not trying to kill you. Cassie hesitated. Well, okay, if you think it's for the best. Sunny and Nephi's helped the blind girl to climb on top of the echo. Then, they used the golden rope to create makeshift reins for Cassie to hold onto. After quickly retrieving soul shards from the dead scavengers, the sleepers hastily left the passage, narrowly avoiding another battle. With Cassie riding comfortably atop the scavenger, their overall speed dramatically increased. Sunny and Nephi's were jogging in the front, hoping to recoup the time lost in the first half of the day and reach the high point with an hour or two to spare. From time to time, they had to take detours to avoid fighting groups of carapace monsters. However, with a monster of their own by their side, the mood and mental state of the three sleepers were much better. For the first time since coming to this place, Sunny felt somewhat calm. Of course, this calmness didn't last long. At some point, he noticed that the wind had picked up a bit. Almost simultaneously, Cassie asked them to stop. Nephi's and Sunny looked at her with deep frowns. It seemed that they both had a bad premonition. "What is it?" The blind girl let go of the reins. "Do you hear anything?" They looked at each other, then shook their heads. "No, why?" Cassie scowled. "Help me get off this thing." After they helped her, she stood motionless for a while, listening. Her scowl deepened. Then the blind girl cautiously kneeled and put her ear to the ground. "What do you hear?" Cassie licked her lips. "It's murmuring." Suddenly, a drop of water fell on Sunny's face. He raised his head and looked at the sky. There, dark, stormy clouds were gathering with unnatural speed. Pretty soon, they were bound to cover it completely, including the sun. And when that happened, his eyes widened. Chapter 48, The Storm. "We need to move now." As Nephi's turned to him, Sunny grabbed Cassie and helped her stand up. His face was even paler than usual, and there was a panicked look in his eyes. "Now, help me get her back on the scavenger." The silver-haired girl raised her head and looked at the sky. Soon, her expression darkened. Without saying anything, she did as he had asked. Cassie seemed a bit disoriented. She grabbed the reins and helplessly turned to her friend. "Neph, what is going on?" Changing Star glanced at her. When she eventually spoke, her voice sounded heavy. "A storm is coming." Meanwhile, Sunny sent his shadow to climb on top of a tall pillar of coral and looked ahead, trying to understand how far the cliffs they were aiming for were. From the look of it, there was still a considerable distance to go. However, the giant statue was already much further away. Going back now would have been suicide. He turned to Nephi's. "We're about 3 or 4 kilometers away from the cliffs. Do you think we can make it?" She scowled. "If we take the most direct route, maybe." Sunny hesitated, then asked, "What about the monsters?" Changing Star looked ahead and gritted her teeth. "We'll have to cut through." "That's it, that's the plan." As he was fruitlessly trying to come up with some devious trick to save them, Nephi's turned her head and glanced at him, puzzled. "What are you waiting for? Run." As they darted forward, heavy drops of rain were starting to fall on the ground. Strong winds were howling between the coral blades, sending bits of mud and seaweed flying. With storm clouds gathering in the sky, sunlight dimmed, and a cold twilight descended upon the labyrinth. Sunny was running with all his might, as though his life depended on it, because it actually did. He was leading their small group, choosing the straightest path toward the cliffs with the help of his shadow. Nephi's was a step behind him. The scavenger carrying Cassie was stomping through the mud with its 8 legs in the back. Without the need to avoid monsters and death breathing down their necks, they moved with amazing speed. Side passages and crimson walls were flashing past them in a blur. There was no need to hold back and conserve strength for the long run. If they were late to reach the cliffs by a minute, their lives would be over. They had to give it their all. Sunny was ready to fight a series of bloody skirmishes all along the way, but to his surprise, the inhabitants of the labyrinth did not give them much trouble. The scavengers seemed to be as panicked as they were. The bulky beasts were busy trying to hide inside the coral mounds or burrowing underground. On the rare occasions, when one of them showed aggression. A quick slash of the sword or a threatening clack of a pincer was enough to make the monster change its mind. However, no matter how fast they were moving, the storm was faster. The rain quickly turned into a pelting downpour, each drop becoming a torrent. The winds grew in strength, striking against their bodies with enough force to make them stumble. The light dimmed even further, reducing visibility to almost zero. Finally, a blinding bolt of lightning tore through the darkness, followed almost immediately by a deafening thunderclap. In the next moment, the ground under Sonny's feet trembled, causing him to lose balance and fall. He rolled in the mud and tried to stand up, but slipped and fell again. Someone's arm grabbed him by the shoulder and helped him rise. In the darkness of the storm, Sonny saw Changing Star's face. She opened her mouth and shouted, "Don't stop, run." He almost couldn't hear her, behind the roaring wind and rain. By the time Sonny began to move, the dark, salty water was already as high as his shins. He gritted his teeth. The sea was coming back. He couldn't determine where the water was coming from, but with each minute it was rising higher. Soon it was up to his knee, then up to his waist, making running almost impossible. The speed of the group slowed down considerably. It was then, in a sudden flash of lightning, when they saw a dark mass of stone ahead. They had made it to the cliffs. Almost at the same time, a terrible rumbling sound came from the depths of the labyrinth. Turning back, Sonny saw a colossal, crushing torrent of black water rushing through the crimson forest. Some distance away, a tardy scavenger was caught by it and thrown against the coral walls. The unbreakable carapace of the mighty creature cracked and burst open like a rotten egg. Curses! He turned to Nephi's. "Time is up, start climbing." She caught him by the arm. "Dismiss your echo." Sonny didn't know whether the scavenger could scale the cliff. In any case, Cassie wouldn't have been able to hold on if it did. He helped the blind girl get down and then sent the monster back to the Sea of Soul. Nephi's lowered herself to let Cassie climb on her back, then tied them together with the golden rope. Not wasting any time, she gritted her teeth and stepped forward to grab onto the wet rocks of the cliff wall. They began the ascent, rushing to get as high as possible before the black torrent hit. Some time later, Sonny screamed, "Brace!" In the next moment, a wall of dark water hit the rocks mere meters beneath their feet. As Sonny held for dear life, the whole cliff shuddered. A few boulders fell from somewhere high above, missing his head only by chance. Somehow, all three of them were still alive. However, things were far from being over. The black water was still rising, now with frightening speed, threatening to swallow them at any second. They had to keep climbing, and they had to be faster than the surging sea. Sonny cursed as he searched for the next hold to grab onto. To survive, he had to scale the face of the cliff with crazy speed. However, hastily climbing wet rocks was a recipe for disaster. One slip of a hand, and he would plunge down to be crushed against the cliffs, drown, or be eaten by some giant monster. The torrential rain and hurricane wind made everything even worse. And yet there was no choice. He frantically kept climbing, tearing his skin on sharp rocks. Every muscle in his body was in agony. If not for the shadow wrapped tightly around his body, Sonny would have been long dead. But even with its help, the surging dark water was getting closer and closer. Damn it all. No matter how hard Sonny tried, he couldn't win back any distance. Soon, the water was at his feet. The sea slowly swallowed his legs, then his torso. He kept climbing, now fighting against the weight of the water and the force of the tide that was trying to tear him away from the cliff. But it was useless in the end. When the water covered his shoulders, he felt his finger slipping from the wet rocks. Sonny tried to hold on, but the current was too strong. He was pushed away like a weightless toy, losing any purchase. No. In the last second, a golden rope fell into the water beside him. Shaken, Sonny grabbed onto it and held with all his strength. The rope drew tight and lifted him out of the water. His feet touched the cliff wall again. Not wasting any time, he resumed climbing with the help of the rope. Finally, A strong hand grabbed him from above and dragged his body over the edge of the cliff. Sonny fell to the ground, struggling to breathe. After some time, he looked at Nephi's, who was lying in a similar position to his right, equally as drained. She was still clutching the golden rope in her hand. Cassie was sitting a few steps away from them. He wanted to laugh, but had no strength for it. They survived. Chapter 49, Natural Element. For a few minutes, Sonny simply lay on the ground, letting the rain hit his face. From time to time, a bolt of lightning arced through the skies, drowning everything in blinding light. Other than that, it was almost completely dark. If not for his attribute, he would have had trouble discerning the shapes of Nephi's and Cassie, who were resting nearby. After some time, however, a feeling of uneasiness entered his mind. Something was off. Sonny scowled, trying to understand where that feeling was coming from. Finally, he realized that it was his shadow. It was trying to draw his attention to something. "Please let me rest. I just want to rest." He was too tired to do anything. Both his body and mind were exhausted. However, the shadow was very persistent. It remained adamant. In the end, Sonny moaned and rolled over on his stomach, then slowly stood up. Nephi's turned her head and looked at him. "What is it?" He grimaced. "I don't know yet. Something feels wrong." Cassie shivered and got closer to Neph. Following his shadow's warning, Sonny looked around, trying to find any sign of danger in their surroundings. Even with his vision, he couldn't see anything out of place. The upper part of the cliffs was well above the stormy sea, forming a small island. Its surface was rugged and uneven, with several protruding ridges breaking the line of sight. There was a large space between their group and the nearest ridge. That space was littered, seemingly at random, with piles of dirt and tall boulders. Nephi's got up and summoned her sword. "Do you see anything?" Sonny frowned. "Not really." At that moment, another lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the small island. His eyes widened. The tall boulders surrounding them were massive and irregularly shaped. They were black in color and motionless. That's why Sonny had not recognized them for what they were at first glance. All around them, scavengers were silently lying on the ground. Sonny froze, suddenly consumed by terror. The hairs on the back of his neck bristled and stood up on ends. 1, 2, 3, he lost count because of panic and gritted his teeth. 7, no, 8 of them. It seemed the 3 humans were not the only ones who thought of taking shelter from the dark sea on these cliffs. He trembled. These cliffs were a death trap. Noticing something on his face, Nephi's tensed. "Sonny." He slowly turned his head to her and whispered, "Don't speak, don't move, just stay where you are." She followed his instructions without asking for the reason. However, a silent question appeared on her face. Cassie did the same. Sonny closed his eyes and breathed in, trying to calm his panicking mind down. There were no hopeless situations. Every problem had a solution. He just had to think of one. The scavengers did not attack yet. Maybe they were asleep or patiently waiting out the storm, trying not to move in fear of attracting more terrifying monsters. Maybe they simply did not notice the humans. After all, it was unknown how well these creatures could see. Were they able to see in the dark? Probably not, or at least not as well as he could. There was still hope. Sonny opened his eyes and looked at the small island again. But this time, his perspective was different. He saw the deep darkness, the clamor of the storm that drowned out most of the sounds, the large distance between the scavenger. This was his territory. It was perfectly suited for a murderous shadow. Didn't he dream of becoming a silent assassin? Well, here was his chance. He just had to execute each step perfectly, crawl through the darkness, strike without alerting the enemy, kill each of them with one precise blow. Rinse and repeat. He already knew their strengths and weaknesses. All that was left was to put that knowledge to practice. And even if he makes a mistake, there were other means to fall back onto. Echo and Nephi's could do their part if he were to land himself in danger. Yes, that could work. It had to. Sonny looked at Changing Star and Cassie. "I'll take care of this." Before they could react, he seemed to dissolve into the shadows. Under the cover of darkness, Sonny sneaked forward. His steps were soft and measured, his breathing controlled. He quickly determined the optimal order of attack to minimize the chance of being discovered and proceeded to the first target, a hulking scavenger that was the furthest away from the pack. Hidden in the shadows, Sonny suddenly felt calm and focused. He felt as though he was finally in his natural element. As the looming silhouette of the scavenger approached, he slowed down and circled around his target. The monster did not move, oblivious to the lurking threat that was drawing closer with each second. Sonny held his breath and prepared to attack. He only had one chance. Do it right. With that thought, he silently lunged forward. One step, too, Sonny jumped and easily landed on the monster's carapace. The azure blade was already in his hand, its steel dark. A moment later, it plunged into the weak point on the scavenger's back, piercing the chitin and destroying its brain. The quiet crack of the breaking carapace was quickly washed away by the rain. It was done. Sonny felt a sense of triumph appear in his heart and quickly suppressed it. This wasn't the right time to celebrate. 7 targets were still waiting for him in the darkness. He retrieved his sword and jumped down from the scavenger's corpse. Then Sonny frowned. Why was the spell silent? It didn't announce his kill, nor the absorption of the shadow fragments. Feeling his skin crawl, Sonny turned around and looked at the scavenger. At first, he was afraid that the beast was still alive, but that wasn't the case. It was as dead as could be. However, on closer inspection, Sonny noticed something that he had missed before. And when he did, his face paled. Chapter 50, Death Trap. The scavenger was dead. However, it wasn't Sonny's blade that killed it. While circling the target, he was focused on staying unnoticed and not alerting the enemy to his presence before reaching the optimal position for an attack. After that, he only saw the monster's back. That's why he didn't notice the terrible wound that ran from the top of the creature's torso to its segmented legs, obscured by the rain. The unbreakable carapace was cut open like a tin can. The scavenger's flesh and mangled organs could be easily seen through the large gap, oozing azure blood. It streamed down only to be washed away by the storm. Sonny gulped. He might have felt awkward about performing a perfect ambush on a long-dead monster, if not for the fear of whatever had killed it in the first place. Looking around, he hesitated and summoned the azure blade back, then wrapped himself in the shadow. The small island was silent except for the howling of the wind. The rain was still falling down, forming a constant veil that hid away all details and distant objects. A rare flash of lightning sometimes flooded this bleak world with stark whiteness. Then, a thunderclap would come, making the skies tremble. With cold fright settling deep into his bones, Sonny cautiously moved to the next scavenger. He could tell from some distance that it was also dead, but had to come closer and make sure. Indeed, he was right. The creature was almost severed in half by the unknown assailant. Its wet innards were lying on the ground in a messy pile. The darkness had long ago stopped being comforting, becoming terrifying and oppressive instead. Sonny shivered. By the time he checked on all 8 monsters and confirmed that they were all dead, he was nauseous and scared out of his wits. When Sonny had first realized that the black shapes were, in fact, scavengers, he thought that the situation was as bad as it could get. Now, he wasn't sure anymore. In fact, he was pretty convinced that things went from bad to worse. Standing near the last scavenger, Sonny observed his surroundings and thought about returning to Neff and Cassie. Maybe the terrifying killer had already left the island. They could just hide and hope for the best. He wouldn't be alone, at least. However, not knowing what kind of danger was hiding in the darkness would drive him insane long before the morning came. Plus, with his fated attribute, hoping for the best was a fool's errand. That's why, although his body was covered in cold sweat, Sonny gritted his teeth and slowly walked toward the ridge that was obscuring the rest of the island from him. Coming close, he started climbing, trying to be as quiet as possible. The ridge wasn't very high, so he was able to scale it without much effort. Sticking close to the rocks, he raised his head and looked down. Then, he immediately wanted to let go and fall to the ground. Right beneath him, just a few meters away, a dark silhouette was outlined against the rocks. It was much larger than the scavengers, with jagged spikes growing out of its thick carapace. Its chitin was black and crimson, like an ancient armor splattered with fresh blood. Instead of pincers, two terrifying bone scythes were protruding from the joints of its arms. Each one was long and sharp enough to split a scavenger in two. Sonny froze, afraid to move. He even stopped breathing. So that's the killer. It was one of those monsters that they had seen retrieving the transcendent soul shards from the giant shark's carcass, or another of their kind. He remembered how the two creatures had cut through the horde of scavengers, killing or throwing aside any beast that got in their way. Slaughtering just 7 of them would not pose a problem for something that deadly. Not to mention getting rid of 3 sleepers. Careful not to make a sound, Sonny slowly lowered himself down. His whole body was trembling. Moving his arms and legs with utmost precision, he began climbing down from the ridge, praying not to be heard, sensed, or noticed in some other way. Luckily, the monster remained oblivious to his presence. Reaching the ground, Sonny took a few steps back, still facing the ridge. He had to force himself to turn around. Feeling as though his back was being pierced by invisible needles, the young man stealthily moved in the direction where he had left his companions. A couple of minutes later, he returned to Nephis and Cassie. The girls were tense and nervous, waiting for his return in the darkness. Before coming out of the shadows, Sonny let them know that he was approaching. "It's me." Nephis moved, lowering her sword a little. Her face was a little grim. "What is the situation?" she said, careful to keep her voice low. Sonny slowly exhaled, finally feeling a bit safer. For the first time, he was genuinely happy not to be alone in this cursed place. "There are 8 scavengers around us, but they're all dead. The killer is one of those big monsters we saw, the thing with the crimson pattern on its carapace and scythes instead of pincers. It's hiding from the storm beneath a stone ridge not far from here." A bolt of lightning flashed, illuminating everything around. In its aftermath, it looked as though 2 white sparks ignited in Changing Star's eyes. Soon, the reflection was gone, leaving them gray and inscrutable again. She tilted her head and whispered, as though talking to herself. "An awakened monster." Sonny licked his lips. "Yeah, so what should we do?" Nephis thought for a while, leaning on her sword. Then she looked at him and said, "Kill it." Sonny stared at her, lost for words. Finally, he collected himself and said the first thing that came to his mind. "Are you nuts?" The idea of fighting that thing was pretty ridiculous, if not completely insane. Realizing that his words might have sounded a bit rude, he cleared his throat and added, "I mean, have you thought this through? How are we supposed to kill that monstrosity?" Nephis slowly inhaled. "It's not a question of thinking things through. We simply have no choice." She glanced at Cassie, who was listening to them with a pale face, and explained. "We can't leave the cliffs before morning, and neither can the monster. However, once the sun rises, it will easily see us and attack. Then, our only advantage, the element of surprise, will be gone. If we have to fight it anyway, it's better to be the ones initiating the fight." Changing Star looked around and added, "It's not completely dark yet, although barely I can still see. Once the night comes, this won't be the case, so we will have to attack it first and do it soon." Sonny shook his head. "This still doesn't explain how we are going to kill it. That thing just dispatched 8 scavengers like it was nothing. We are not its opponents. We don't even know its weaknesses." Nephis frowned. After a short pause, she said, "It's just an awakened monster." Sonny couldn't help but stare at her in disbelief. "What do you mean, just an awakened monster? Have you forgotten that all 3 of us are only sleepers? Dormant humans are not supposed to be able to deal with awakened beasts, let alone monsters. The fact that we can reliably kill scavengers is already abnormal." She looked back at him, undisturbed, and simply answered, "But we are abnormal." Sonny stood there with his mouth open, not knowing what to say. Nephis sighed. You and I both are not exactly ordinary sleepers, aren't we? Don't try and deny it. Someone ordinary simply would not have survived in this place. He frowned, not happy about her line of thought. Meanwhile, Changing Star continued. You, me, plus the awakened beast you have as an echo, plus the advantage of a surprise attack. I'm not saying that it will be easy. We might die, but there's a good chance that we won't. She looked down at the silvery blade of her sword and added after a couple of seconds. In any case, as I have already said, we don't have a choice. Sunny gritted his teeth, trying to find a logical retort. However, her reasoning seemed unassailable. He just had a really bad feeling about fighting that monster. In the ensued silence, Cassie, who had been quiet all this time, suddenly spoke. You are forgetting about the main advantage we have over that thing. Both of them looked at her, surprised. The blind girl turned to face them and slightly lifted her head. We are intelligent, and the monster is not. Her words echoed in the darkness. Sunny sighed. It seemed that a fight with the bone scythe monster was inevitable. Some time later, he was standing in the darkness, looking at the terrifying creature in front of him. His expression was grim and somber. Tightly gripping the azure blade, Sunny slowly inhaled. The ominous feeling he had before was still there, now stronger than ever. I don't like this. With this thought, he exhaled and raised his hand. Chapter 51, Carapace Centurion. Monsters did possess some rudimentary intelligence, however, they could not compare to humans. At their core, they were still predators who acted mostly on instinct. Their cunning was beastly in nature and was not that hard to overcome. That gave the three sleepers a chance to leverage their advantage. After finalizing the plan, they made some preparations. While Changing Star was getting ready, Sunny had retrieved the soul shards from the 8 dead scavengers. After delivering them to the silver-haired girl, he watched as she brought them to her chest and crushed them in her fist one after another, absorbing the essence of each shard into her soul core. After a few minutes, when the changes caused by the absorption were over, Nephi's opened her eyes and slowly inhaled. To a sleeper, consuming the shards of 8 awakened beasts was equivalent to slaying 16 dormant creatures. While not tremendous, it was still a significant boost in physical ability. Her body had become stronger, faster, enhanced in every way. They were going to need every bit of that strength to survive. Because of how attuned Nephi's was to her physicality, getting accustomed to her new limits did not take long. Very soon, she looked at him and asked, Are you ready? Sunny sighed, glanced at his shadow, hoping to get some moral support. The shadow pretended to not notice and ignored him. Disloyal bastard. As ready as I'll ever be. Nephi's nodded and turned to Cassie. There was nothing really to say. They had already discussed everything there was to discuss, and empty words could not make the blind girl worry any less. Come to think of it, Sunny wouldn't have wanted to trade places with her, even though out of the 3 of them she was the only one who didn't have to risk her life in combat. Facing the enemy, no matter how terrifying, was better than waiting powerlessly for the outcome, knowing that there's nothing you can do to change it. From that point of view, he was actually the lucky one. Cassie tried to put on a brave face. She turned to Nephi's and forced a smile. Go and kill that thing. Maybe you'll finally get something decent to wear and stop making me feel so guilty. A corner of Changing Star's lip curled up. Okay. After that, she turned to Sunny and returned to her usual serious self. Let's go. A few minutes later, he was standing on top of the rocky ridge, looking down at the deadly monster. The shadow was wrapped around his body, enhancing Sunny's physical abilities. Their plan was pretty solid and had a high chance of working. However, he still couldn't get rid of the ominous feeling that this was not going to end well. I don't like this. With a sigh, Sunny raised his hand and summoned the silver bell. Then he lightly shook it, causing the clear melodic ringing to resound amidst the storm. Immediately, the monster below moved, turning its massive torso around and looking for the source of the sudden noise. As he saw Sunny, a mad crimson flame ignited in its eyes. However, Sunny did not see any of this, because he was already facing the other way. As soon as the bell rang, he turned around and jumped down from the ridge without a second of hesitation. The ridge wasn't very tall, but there was still a considerable distance to the ground. Sunny hit the rocks hard and rolled, trying to disperse the force of the impact. As soon as he got back to his feet, he ran, trying to get as far away as possible. A moment later, the ridge exploded behind his back. The monster simply crashed into it with its hulking body, breaking through the layers of rocks as though they were paper. Simultaneously, there was a flash of lightning and a thunderclap, drowning the loud rumble of the falling debris. The creature locked onto retreating Sunny and lunged forward, trying to pierce his body with one of its scythes. Shards of rock were flowing like a torrent from its spiked carapace. Luckily, Sunny was already far enough. Without slowing down, he lowered his body, ran for several more meters, and then turned around. The picture of the monster, who was more than 3 meters tall, rushing at him like a speeding train was enough to make any person falter. However, Sunny stood his ground, raising the azure blade above his head. After all, he was the bait. Half a dozen meters away from him, the monster finally reached their trap. Almost unnoticeable in the darkness and the pouring rain, the golden rope was strung between 2 massive boulders at the height of the creature's leg joints. Earlier, Sunny had lowered his body to run beneath it. Overwhelmed by bloodlust, the monster did not notice the tautly drawn rope and ran into it at full speed. If it was a normal rope, it would, without a doubt, immediately snap. However, the golden rope was a memory, and being incredibly sturdy was one of its attributes. The rocks it was tied to, unfortunately, were quite mundane. They shattered almost immediately. But the damage was already done. With its front legs suddenly jerked backward, the scythe slayer lost its balance and crashed into the ground face first, sliding forward on wet stone and leaving behind a shallow trench. Sunny jumped away. The monster was unperturbed. Almost immediately, 2 bone scythes pierced the ground, jerking its massive body to a stop. In the next moment, unexpectedly swift and nimble for its size, it was already beginning to rise. If it was allowed to stand up, their fates would be sealed. Fortunately, Sunny's echo was faster. The moment the monster fell, it stopped pretending to be one of the dead scavengers, got up and dashed forward. Just as their enemy was about to rise, it jumped on its carapace from behind, pinning the creature down with its weight, and locked its pincers on the creature's arms just beneath the point where the bone scythes began. Despite the fact that the echo was wounded by the spikes growing from the monster's carapace, it succeeded in immobilizing it, at least for a second. A second was enough. As though out of nowhere, Nephi's, who was lying in ambush, appeared in front of the monster. Darting between its terrifying sides, she leaned forward and delivered a devastating thrust with her longsword, putting her whole weight behind it. They didn't know if the awakened monster had the same weak spot on its back as its lesser relatives, the scavengers, had. However, there was no reason to assume that there was no gap between its carapace and torso armor. It was a mechanical issue. Anything that had to be flexible could not be too rigid. The tip of Changing Star's sword plunged into the narrow gap. Then, the sword disappeared into the monster's body, penetrating so deep that its hilt ended up brushing against the chitin. Hell yes, Sunny thought, triumphant. However, in the next second, his expression dimmed. Because the creature didn't even seem to notice the wound that was supposed to be, if not fatal, then at least heavily debilitating. Straining its body a little, it suddenly twisted, throwing the echo off its carapace, and rose to its feet. The bone scythes scraped against the rock as it pulled them out from the ground. Defenseless, Nephi's was right in front of it, her sword still stuck in the monster's flesh. Oh no. Sunny was too far away to do anything, circling around the massive creature to attack it from behind. The echo was on the ground, still reeling from being thrown off the enemy's back. It didn't seem like it could help either. For the moment, Changing Star was on her own. The scythes pierced the air, aiming for her flesh. At the last moment, however, a pair of pincers locked one of them into an iron grip. That gave Nephi's another fraction of a second to react. Letting go of the sword, she dove under the creature's body, hiding in the blind spot of the remaining scythe's attack range. As far as hiding places went, this one wasn't optimal, since all the monster had to do to crush her into a bloody pulp was to lie down. However, in that moment, Nephi's had no other choice. This is bad, this bad. By then, Sonny was already behind the creature. Hoping to buy Neph some time, he brandished the azure blade and slashed down. The sword connected with the joint of one of the monster's rear legs, drawing azure blood. However, unlike how it was in the battle against a scavenger, he failed to completely sever the limb. It was too tough and thick. In the next moment, the leg disappeared from Sonny's field of vision. Crap. As that thought appeared in his mind, Sonny raised his head and looked at the monster. Somehow, it had already turned around and was now facing him, two crimson flames burning with bloodlust in its eyes. Before Sonny could properly react, the sharp tip of a bone scythe hit him in the chest with the force of a siege ram. The only thing he managed to do was to transfer the shadow from his body to the puppeteer's shroud. Because of this lightning-fast decision, the armor held. He wasn't pierced through the heart and impaled on the scythe. However, it was a small consolation. The force of the blow was still enough to make his ribcage cave in and send his body flying through the air like a rag doll. Somehow, Sonny found himself lying on the ground. His body felt weird and he couldn't breathe. Something bitter was flowing from his mouth, making him choke. It was blood. He was drowning in his own blood. Weakly, Sonny tried to move, but his limbs wouldn't listen to him. Only the shadow listened, enveloping his body and delaying the inevitable a little. I'm hurt. With his thoughts moving slower and slower, as though submerged in a dense fog, he looked up, hoping to see the stars. Instead, he saw two burning crimson eyes approaching him from the darkness. Chapter 52, Clarity. In that moment, hovering on the edge of nothingness, Sonny realized that he was about to die. He had to struggle against the fog that permeated his mind, slowing down his thoughts and dampening all emotions. All except for fear. Despite the fact that his body was broken and his mind was paralyzed, some stubborn part of Sonny was still refusing to give up. He wasn't ready to die, at least not without giving his all to survive. He was revolted at the thought of giving the world the satisfaction of the win. That would be so infuriating. Hadn't he told Hero that he was going to survive no matter what, to spite them all? That's right. He might be a shameless liar, but a promise was still a promise. But how was he even supposed to survive? No matter how he looked at it, the situation seemed to be hopeless. As the Scythe Slayer approached, its eyes shining menacingly with bloodthirsty crimson light, Sonny tried to pierce through the fog that enveloped his mind. However, his attempts were aimless and weak. It was hard to find purchase in the fog. He needed an anchor. Suddenly, a simple thought caught his attention. It was something that he had repeated 1,000 times, burning it into his mind. Repetition, experience clarity. Clarity. He remembered what Nephi's had taught him. The essence of combat was murder. Any action performed during a battle served only one of two purposes. It was either to kill your enemy or prevent the enemy from killing you. If he could learn that, he would have enough clarity to master the mind. Back then, he didn't really understand the profound meaning behind the simple word clarity that Nephi's had used. But now, with his mind in shambles, he was finally able to grasp it. The two truths behind the essence and purpose of combat were simple and solid, almost tangible. Even in his half-conscious state, he was able to use them as a stable foundation in the fog. Then, he reformed his mind around this foundation, building it along the stark lines of that truth. Suddenly, he was able to think again. What's more, his thoughts were clear and incredibly fast, free of all unnecessary distractions. This was clarity. Sonny looked up at the advancing monster, calmly weighing his options. His body was pretty much useless. He couldn't move his limbs at all. The shadow still followed his commands, but it was busy doing an important job, keeping him from dying immediately. Even with its help, he wouldn't be able to last long. But this was a useless thought. He couldn't do anything about it, so there was no sense in wasting time considering it further. With his body immobilized, memories couldn't be used. That left only the echo. The carapace scavenger was going to have to be his only tool to either kill the enemy or prevent the enemy from killing him. The monster was quickly approaching Sunny. Its mandibles moved, viscous saliva flowing down from them in a torrent of transparent mucus. In a flash of lightning, he was able to see and instantly register every spike, every scratch, every abrasion on the creature's carapace. The handle of Changing Star's sword was still protruding from its body, washed in azure blood. What an ugly bastard. Sunny was being hypocritical. Truth be told, with its black carapace painted with crimson patterns and a mighty body specially designed for mayhem and slaughter, the Scythe Slayer looked striking and incredibly menacing. It was almost majestic, in a terrifying, murderous kind of way. Unable to move, he had to look helplessly as the monster closed the distance between them and loomed over Sunny's broken, bleeding body. Its scythes rose into the air, ready to strike down. Looking right into the monster's burning eyes, Sunny thought, "Go to hell, you overgrown bug." The scythes shot toward his body. In the last moment, something massive and furious rammed into the monster from the side, throwing it away. It was Sunny's carapace scavenger. Not bothering with its own safety anymore, the echo entwined itself with the enemy in a chaotic mess of limbs as they rolled on the ground. Despite the fact that it was smaller and weaker, its crazy assault and complete disregard for its own life were enough to give the bigger monster some pause. The echo lashed out with its pincers, ramming them against the creature's carapace in a crazy whirlwind of blows. For a moment, the howling of the wind was drowned out by the clamor of chitin striking against chitin. The Slayer's carapace mostly held, but a couple of cracks did appear on its black surface. However, it was still superior to the scavenger in every way. Even with one of its scythes pinned awkwardly under its body, the monster was more than able to repel the sudden attack. With an angry screech, it sliced with the other scythe, cutting one of the scavenger's pincer arms clean off. Then, it strained its legs and threw the smaller creature away. In the process, the rear leg that was already wounded by Sunny broke off, but the monster didn't pay it any attention. Burning with madness and fury, it untangled its limbs and slowly stood up. Another deafening screech resounded in the howling darkness of the storm, hurting Sunny's ears. Now what? He thought, momentarily lost for ideas. But then, something very unexpected happened. As the Slayer moved to finish off the echo, it had to slightly raise and lean its torso back to account for the loss of a rear leg and keep its balance. At that moment, a bolt of lightning landed right in the middle of the small island. With how tall the monster was, the lightning was immediately attracted to the handle of the sword that was still sticking from its body, aimed at the sky at a slight angle. At that moment, Changing Star's longsword suddenly became a lightning rod. Instantly, hundreds of millions of volts of electricity coursed through the Slayer's body. In a blinding flash of light, it was thrown to the ground. Wisps of smoke rose from the cracks in its carapace. In a strange turn of events, arcs of residual electricity danced on the monster's chitin, slowly accumulating on the crimson patterns on it. Under that influence, the crimson pattern changed its color, becoming white and incandescent. Sunny stared at all this in bewilderment. "It's glowing." For a second, he hoped that the monster was dead. But no, a single strike of lightning was not enough to kill a creature like that. Just a few moments after being electrocuted, the Slayer moved, slightly shaking its body. Although it was in a rather bad shape, it was still alive and full of murderous intent. Looking somewhat dazed, the monster gathered its limbs and tried to stand up. Slowly but surely, it was coming back to its senses. The bone scythes scraped against the rocks, helping it rise. However, before it did, Nephi's was suddenly right in front of it. Grabbing the hilt of the longsword, she grimaced as the heat burned her hands. Then, she twisted the blade, making the Slayer's body twitch, and pulled it out, breaking apart a large portion of its lower torso armor. The monster tried to slash at her with a scythe, but Changing Star was quicker. Dashing to the side, she simultaneously lashed out with her sword. The glowing, white-hot blade caught the creature's arm right below the joint and cleaved through it, sending the terrifying bone scythe flying through the air in a rain of azure blood. The Slayer screeched and swatted her away with one of its legs. Nephi's was thrown back and rolled on the rocks, losing her grip on the sword. Her eyes momentarily lost focus. The monster, on the contrary, was back to its sense. It seemed as though the sudden pain of losing a limb had shaken it wide awake. Raising to its full height, it opened its ugly mouth and let out a deafening, enraged shriek. Then, it lunged toward Neph, with all-consuming hatred burning in its eyes. But it didn't get far. Right as the livid monster was beginning its attack, the battered echo appeared in its path. Its one remaining pincer shot forward, plunging into the wide gap in the armor created by Changing Star's sword. Twisting its arm, the scavenger pushed it inside the enemy's body, wreaking havoc on its innards. In the end, it even lifted the whole monster in the air a little, its pincer going in almost up to the shoulder. The Slayer lashed out with its scythe, piercing the echo's chest through. Then, it twitched a couple of times and fell still. The scavenger screeched angrily and jerked its pincer, tearing the bigger monster's torso clean off its carapace. Proudly giving the eviscerated enemy one last look, it then staggered and collapsed to the ground. Sonny tiredly dismissed the echo, hoping that it can survive. He wasn't feeling too well. In fact, he was pretty much done for. You have slain an awakened monster, Carapace Centurion. The spell's voice fell uselessly on his deaf ears. It sounded distorted and distant. You have received a memory, Starlight Legion armor. Your shadow grows stronger. I won. Sonny closed his eyes, finally allowing pain and exhaustion to flood his mind. The fog was back, making everything feel like it was happening to someone else. He was tired, and he couldn't breathe. Drowning in blood was not very pleasant. As his conscience began to slip, he heard the sound of someone's hurried steps. And then, two soft hands gently touched his face. Chapter 53, Immortal Flame. Somewhat surprised, Sonny struggled to open his eyes. As his vision slowly focused, he saw Neph's pale face looming above him. Her short silver hair was wet, sticking close to her skin. She was standing on her knees beside his broken body, caressing his face with her hands. In her eyes, there was a strange expression. It was as though she was frightened, but resigned to something. Her pupils were wide and dark. What? Greeting her teeth, Nephi's moved her hands to his collapsed chest and pressed them lightly against it, causing a pulse of pain to radiate through Sonny's body. Then, a soft, radiant brilliance suddenly ignited beneath the skin of her palms, reflecting in her gray eyes like two dancing white sparks. Almost immediately, Changing Star's face contorted in a grimace of excruciating agony, and she let out a terrible, muffled scream. Her skin became white as a sheet of paper, and as she bit her lower lip, drops of blood soon rolled to her chin. As the radiance grew in intensity, Nephi's shut her eyes tightly, tears streaming down her tortured, bloodless face. Sonny, on the contrary, felt like he was in heaven. All pain disappeared from his body, replaced by gentle, all-encompassing warmth. He felt as though he was being cleansed by something pure and sacred. By a white, pristine, purifying flame. Under the influence of the flame, his dying body began to repair itself. His shattered bones were reassembled from the shards. His torn flesh regenerated and became whole again. His collapsed lungs and damaged heart were brought back to life and rejuvenated, instantly turning strong and healthy. Suddenly, he could breathe again. As his chest moved, drawing in a new breath, Nephi's flinched away with a harrowing moan. The white radiance beneath her skin dimmed and disappeared, letting the darkness return to its rightful place. Crawling away a few steps, Changing Star stopped, standing on her knees and hands, and violently vomited. Her whole body was shivering uncontrollably, as though on the verge of a seizure. As the shivers died down, she slowly lowered herself to the ground and lay there motionlessly, catching the raindrops with her mouth. Sunny, meanwhile, raised his hands and carefully explored his body. To his surprise, nothing really hurt. It was as though he was never wounded in the first place, let alone almost died. With the help of Nephi's and her mysterious aspect ability, he was completely healed. It was a miracle. By the time the storm was over, it was already deep into the night. Sunny, Nephi's, and Cassie huddled together for warmth and slept as though they were dead, too tired to make someone keep watch. If anything were to happen, the shadow would probably alarm them in advance. If not, so be it. They were just too exhausted to care. Luckily, the rest of the night went without incidents. In the morning, no one was in a hurry to make any plans or suggest leaving the cliffs. They just gathered some meat from the dead carapace centurion and the scavengers, collected the 2 soul shards, and moved to the opposite side of the small island, afraid that the remains would attract some creature's attention. As it turned out, they were right. Not long after the group left the place of the battle, a dark spot appeared in the sky. Soon, it became larger and approached the cliffs, landing near the corpse of the centurion in a whirlwind. Sunny had never seen anything like it. The creature was massive in size, easily weighing twice as much as the carapace monster. Its body was white as a corpse and muscular, like that of a lion. It had 2 mighty paws in the back and 6 in the front, protruding messily out of its wide chest. Each ended with long, sharp talons. The neck of the flying monstrosity was covered in long black feathers, as well as its enormous wings. Its head resembled that of a raven, with large round eyes and a terrifying black beak. While they hid behind rocks, the creature feasted on the dead centurion, easily breaking its carapace apart with its talons and beak. Then, satisfied, it grabbed a few scavenger carcasses with its paws and rose back into the air, creating a small hurricane with each flap of its black wings. The creature left the cliffs and flew back the way it came. It was moving west. Following the black dot as it disappeared into the distance, Sunny sighed. "Neph, what do you think that thing is?" Nephi's was also looking at the sky. After a few seconds, she lowered her gaze. "I have no idea." Sunny simply nodded and went about his business. He still had to perform his 1,000 strikes. After making a fire, they roasted the centurion's meat and had a delicious, hefty breakfast. Then, stuffed, the 3 of them lied down and lazily rested. After fighting against 2 scavengers at once, running away and barely surviving the sudden flood, climbing tall cliffs in the middle of a storm and battling an awakened monster, all done in a single day, they deserved some time off. Plus, Sunny needed to sort himself out. Truth be told, he was feeling a bit strange. The reason for this was not his traumatic near-death experience, although it had a lot to do with it. The thing was that, after the unexpected epiphany he had while trying to fight against the deathly mind fog, Sunny felt as though he had been changed. Because the clarity he gained never went away. It was still here, at the center of his being. He felt as though his very way of thinking and perceiving the world was now completely different. It was stark, streamlined, and dauntless. Sunny felt that he had become calmer. He was now able to think much faster and act without hesitation. Many things that previously seemed obscure and frightening suddenly became predictable and thus surmountable. It was as though he had discovered an underlying order to the world that wasn't there before. That inner understanding gave him an advantage that was hard to explain with words. In a sense, this change was even more profound than the transformation of his body at the end of the first nightmare. He felt that he had made a big leap in his combat ability and overall power, even though it wasn't tied to the number of consumed shadow fragments or unlocked aspect abilities. Looking at the sky, Sunny wondered if this was how Nephi's always felt. Probably. Mastery of the body, mastery of the mind. Right. He was still far away from being a master, but it felt as though he was on the right track. Some time later, Sunny approached the western edge of the cliffs. Nephi's was sitting there, her feet dangling over the edge. She was looking west, lost in her thoughts. He sat down beside the silver-haired girl and followed her gaze, trying to guess what she was thinking about. Just like always, he failed. Changing Star was hard to understand. Sunny shifted, feeling incredibly embarrassed. Finally, he gathered his courage and said, "You saved my life twice yesterday." Nephi's glanced at him and turned away again. "I did." He hesitated, trying to find the correct words. In the end, he couldn't come up with anything and simply said, "Thank you." This time, she looked at him a bit longer. Her face was calm and indifferent. "There's no need to thank me. Without you and your shadow, we would have drowned before reaching the cliffs or been torn apart by a large group of scavengers after stumbling on them in the labyrinth." After that uncharacteristically long sentence, she fell silent and added after a while, "We're allies." Sunny nodded, knowing that she was right. Still, Nephi's went above and beyond to keep him alive. Even if he had also done his part, not everyone would have gone to such lengths to return the favor. However, he didn't say anything about it, mostly because he could already imagine her answer. Staring right at him, she would stay quiet for some time and then say something like, "I just wanted to," or "It is what it is," in a flat tone. And then there would be an awkward silence. With a subtle smile, Sunny looked away. A minute or two later, he said, "It's you flaw, isn't it? The pain you feel every time you use your ability." Nephi's was silent for a while before answering. Then, she simply said, "Yes." Sunny looked at her. Changing Star's profile was calm and distant. The wind was playing with her short silver hair. "What does it feel like?" She was staring into the distance. "Like burning alive." He sighed, trying to imagine what kind of suffering someone being burned alive would have to endure. As always, the spell was vile and cruel. "I'm sorry," he said quietly after some time. Nephi's shrugged, not turning her head. "It's just pain." Sunny looked away, trying to hide his expression. Just pain. These might have been the saddest words he had ever heard. Chapter 54, Spoils of War. For a long while, they just sat quietly together. Nephi's was looking at the horizon, thinking about something only she knew about. Sunny's mind was strangely empty. From time to time, he would cast a glance inside his soul sea, observing the recuperating echo. The scavenger managed to survive its fight against the carapace centurion, even if it was just barely. Now, enveloped in a cocoon of light, it was flowing in the calming darkness of Sunny's soul and slowly regenerating. If an echo managed to retreat into the sea of soul alive, it would eventually recover from any wounds. The holes on the scavenger's carapace were already beginning to close. Its lost pincer arm, however, was not growing back anytime soon. Sunny sighed and summoned the runes. He decided to go over the spoils of the harrowing battle. Shadow fragments, 28/1000. Since it was his echo that delivered the final blow, the kill was considered to be his. Thus, he received 4 shadow fragments, 2 for each of the Centurion's awakened cores. The shards of the cores themselves went to Nephi's as per their agreement. She decided to consume one herself and give the other one to Cassie. The reward was sizable, but seemed disproportionate to the amount of trouble they had gone through to get rid of the terrifying monster. Ultimately, dormant humans like them were really not supposed to battle awakened nightmare creatures. No way, really, he thought to himself, full of sarcasm. It was just their bad luck that there was not a single dormant creature in this whole damned region of the dream realm. Sunny remembered his lofty plans of hunting weak monsters while safely protected from all their attacks by his Tier 5 awakened armor, and couldn't help but smile bitterly. Who knew that the puppeteer's shroud would turn out to be merely a minimum requirement for survival, as opposed to a huge, odds-defying advantage? Still, that armor had already saved his life twice, so it was doing its job. Speaking of armor, he lowered his gaze. Memory, Starlight Legion armor. Memory rank, awakened. Memory type, armor. Memory description. Born in the all-consuming darkness, 7 valiant heroes made an oath to return light to the cursed land. Time has erased their names and their faces, but the memory of the defiant oath still remains. Teacher Julius would have been ecstatic to be reading this stuff. The old man used to be an avid explorer and student of the Dream Realm's history before becoming a professor in the Awakened Academy and settling down in one of the most prosperous human citadels. He was still one of the leading researchers in that field, often irritating hunting expeditions with requests to explore this or that ruin. Sadly, Sonny had no idea when they would meet again. He cleared his throat and looked at Nephi's. "Anyway, I have a present for you." She turned her head and looked at him with a bit of confusion. "A present?" Sonny smiled. "Yeah, I forgot to tell you that I received a memory after we finished off the Centurion. Guess what type it is?" He glanced at her expectantly. However, Changing Star did not guess. In fact, her expression did not even show a hint of curiosity. After an awkward pause, Sonny had to look away. It's an armor, so give me your hand." Physical contact was required to transfer a memory. Otherwise, he would have preferred to avoid it for as long as possible. There had already been too much contact between them for his mental composure. In retrospect, being invaded by the healing flame was a strangely intimate experience, not to mention the memory of her soft touch. Not that he had been in any condition to think about such things back then. Staring right at him, Nephi's slowly held out a hand. Sonny hurriedly grasped it in his own, wishing to be done with this part of the process as soon as possible. Her skin was cool and soft. Trying not to get distracted, he willed the Starlight Legion armor to be expelled from his soul sea. One of the spheres of light disappeared from the Shadow Core's orbit. Immediately, he felt something akin to a spark of electricity moving through his body and into Changing Stars. She blinked and retracted her hand. Then Nephi stood up, walked a few steps away from the edge of the cliff, and summoned the memory. Spinning sparks of light appeared around her. A moment later, they covered her porcelain body and turned into a black, skin-tight bodysuit made out of an unknown, durable material. It looked quite similar to the rubbery seaweed that permeated the area. Then, intricate pieces of pristine white plate armor materialized over the black bodysuit. First the greaves and vambraces, then articulated pauldrons and rerebraces, then cuisses and sabatons. Finally, a breastplate engraved with 7 shining stars appeared to protect Neph's torso, short enough to pose no hindrance to her mobility. It was followed by a helmet with a white plume. The engraving of the 7 stars was identical to those carved into the giant knight statue's cuirass. The armor looked light and elegant. It was simultaneously functional and flattering, both providing high levels of protection and accentuating the graceful lines of Changing Star's body. A stark contrast of black and white made for quite a striking sight. Nephi's dismissed the helmet, letting her silver hair move in the wind. Then, she summoned her sword and performed a few tentative pirouettes, testing out the weight and flexibility of the armor. Seemingly satisfied, she then let the sword disappear into the air. Sonny observed all this in silence. When Neph was finally done, he asked, "Well, how is it?" She turned to him. Soon, a wide smile appeared on her face. Beaming with delight, Nephi's hesitated and finally said with a bit of embarrassment, "Much better." Sonny heaved a sigh of relief. At least now all 3 of them were properly closed. That was good. Really good. Not only because Changing Stars' combat effectiveness would dramatically increase due to the acquisition of a reliable armor, but also because now he wouldn't have to be distracted every time he saw her. Chapter 55, Lucky People. When they returned to the makeshift camp, the first thing that Nephi's did was come up to Cassie. "Hey, Cass, guess what?" The blind girl turned to her and smiled. "You've finally received an armor-type memory." Simultaneously, Nephi said, "I found something decent to wear." Then she fell silent and stared at her smiling friend. Cassie laughed. The sound of your footsteps changed. Changing Star blinked. Ah, I see. Well, it's from the Carapace Centurion. While she was describing the armor to Kasha and letting her touch the mysterious white metal it was forged out of, Sunny relaxed and rested by the fire. Some time later, Nephi's was busy preparing dinner. Sunny was once again lying lazily on the stones and staring into the sky. The sky, like always, was gray and unfriendly. With all three of them equipped with decent armor, they were finally starting to resemble a real awakened cohort. In fact, Sunny thought that their group was rather eye-catching even by awakened standards. In her light tunic and sea-wave cloak, beautiful and delicate Cassie looked like a princess. Lithe and poised, Nephi's was like a noble knight tasked with protecting her. Sunny, however, if he was generous to himself, he would say that he looked like a young squire. But truthfully, he resembled a page boy a lot more, at best. If a random stranger were to see the three of them, that stranger would most likely assume that Sunny was either a lowly servant or a feeble ruffian that had been captured by the noble ladies' guard. Well, that'll just add to their surprise when I stab them in the back. Wait, why would he stab a random stranger? Ah, who cares? I'm sure there'll be a reason. At that moment, Cassie sat down by his side. Sunny turned his head, looking at the blind girl with a bit of surprise. She bit her lip. Nephi's told me that you almost died yesterday. Oh, so that's what this is about. He shrugged. Yeah. Then, with a silent sigh, Sunny added, but don't worry about it too much. It's not my first brush with death. Although it was, as far as he knew, the closest, the memory still sent shivers running down his spine. Cassie was silent for a while. Then she quietly said, I'm sorry. Sunny raised his eyebrows. Sorry, what are you sorry for? The blind girl lowered her eyes. For being so useless. Sunny frowned and looked away. A second or two later, he said in his usual careless tone, You're not useless. Cassie softly chuckled. Aren't I? If I want to walk, I need to be leashed to you or Neff. If I want to eat, I need to wait for one of you to feed me. That's my life now. I can't do even the simplest of things without your help, let alone be of use to either of you in return. Slowly, her voice turned raw with emotion. This was the first time Sunny had seen her mask of resolve slip a little, revealing the desperate, angry, frightened face beneath. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, Hey, have I ever told you about my first nightmare? The blind girl shook her head. Sunny half closed his eyes. My first nightmare was as bad as it gets. To tell you the truth, the situation was pretty hopeless. I was a slave destined to die of cold or mistreatment. Chained, bleeding, defenseless. What's worse, my aspect turned out to be completely useless. I mean, literally. If I remember correctly, the phrase the spell chosen to describe it was a useless wretch with no skills or abilities worth a mention. Cassie turned her head slightly, visibly drawn in by his words. Then, how did you survive? Did things change for the better? Sunny smiled. Gods no. In fact, they quickly turned worse. Much, much worse. But what would you know? In a strange twist of fate, my useless aspect turned out to be the only thing that could guide me through that mess alive. In that regard, I was incredibly lucky. He shifted a little and glanced at the delicate girl, noticing a thoughtful frown on her face. But here is a thing about luck. People usually speak about it as though luck is something that just happens to you. It's not. Luck is 50% circumstance and 50% your own ability to grasp it. Luck is something you have to make happen yourself. I fought with everything I had to survive. That's one of the two reasons I'm still here. Saying that, Sunny remembered the cold, dark mountain and shivered. Then, pushing the chilling memories away, he continued. The second reason is the spell itself. I won't go as far as to call it reasonable, but it is fair in its own perverted way. The spell takes with one hand and gives with the other. It was like this with my first nightmare, and it is the same with you. Cassie's frown deepened. Sunny chose his next words very carefully. Eventually, he said, Your flaw is the most debilitating one I have ever seen or heard of. You are right, without help from someone like Neff, it would have been a certain death sentence. And people like her, well, I'm not even sure that someone else like that exists. But the blind girl gritted her teeth. But what? Sunny looked at her with a serious expression. But that also means that the other side of the flaw, your power, is equally as extraordinary. You just haven't found the way to grasp it yet. When you do, believe me, you'll remember this conversation and feel very embarrassed about how naive and foolish you were. Cassie's expression changed to one of doubt and confusion. Do you really think so? She whispered. There was a hint of desperate desire in her voice. However, the question itself almost made him laugh, for an obvious reason. Trust me, I'm the most honest person in the world. 2 worlds, in fact. Sunny would actually love nothing more than to be less honest, but sadly, he was physically incapable of doing so. Of course, she didn't have to know that. Cassie was silent for a long time, lost in thought. It looked as though she was in the throes of some inner struggle. Sunny almost assumed that their conversation was over, but then she suddenly said in a low, raspy voice, I had more visions than I told you guys about. Chapter 56, the heaviest thing in the world. He blinked, staring at the blind girl with surprise and a bit of apprehension. Her sudden statement really threw him off. Why would she keep something like this secret? And why tell him now? Confused, he asked carefully. More visions? Why haven't you told us? A fleeting, tired smile appeared on Cassie's face. She lowered her head and remained silent for a while. Then, closing her eyes, she said, You probably don't know. How could you know? But knowledge can be really heavy. It can be as heavy as the heaviest thing in the world. Then, a sad smile appeared on her face. I am afraid that by telling you, I will actually cause the things I saw to come true. Sunny tensed up, alarmed by the implication behind her words. If she was afraid of the visions coming true, then their content must have been pretty bad. And if it was really bad, if something terrible was destined to befall them, Sunny had to know about it in advance. That way, he would be able to make preparations and deal with whatever happens. As long as he was prepared, many things would become much less dire. However, what if his preparations would become the very reason for that terrible thing to happen, making Cassie's vision a self-fulfilling prophecy? This was the danger of knowing the future. Damn it, my head hurts. I hate this crap. Sunny struggled for a long time, trying to decide if he should pressure Cassie to reveal her visions. Either outcome was going to leave him uneasy, so he was really not sure what to do. In the end, unable to make a decision, Sunny simply remained silent. Cassie also didn't say anything. After some time had passed, she finally spoke. Can you just promise me one thing? It seemed as though this was her attempt to find a compromise between revealing everything and doing nothing. Sunny frowned. That depends on what it is. The blind girl hesitated before speaking. Can you promise that you'll take care of Neff, no matter what? He delayed answering for as long as the growing pain allowed him. When it became almost unbearable, Sunny reluctantly said, I can't. I can barely take care of myself. He also didn't trust Nephi's enough to make a promise like that. He had nothing against Changing Star and even liked her quite a bit, but they didn't really know each other. Their alliance was one of necessity, not choice. Who knew what would happen once their need for each other was no longer there? No matter what was too steep of a requirement. Of course, he could have misled Cassie by answering, yes. After all, the question was whether or not he could make a promise, not whether or not he would follow through with it. But at that moment, Sunny was strangely reluctant to deceive the blind girl. Maybe that whole honesty thing was slowly growing on him. Cassie sighed and turned away. Suddenly, it felt like something imperceptible about her changed. I see. Yeah, that's fair. With that, she summoned her staff and walked away, leaving Sunny in a somber and uneasy mood, just like he had expected. No matter how much he tried to relax after that, his thoughts kept wandering. Eventually, Sunny found himself trying to find connections between various pieces of information about the starless void, or the forgotten shore, as it was called in the Azure Blade's description. If nothing else, it could distract him from thinking about the latter part of their conversation with Cassie. Also, for some reason, the need to understand their environment suddenly seemed much more vital. His sword, the Starlight Legion armor, the carapace monsters, and the giant headless statue seemed to be connected in some way, but he couldn't quite understand how. Was the statue a monument to one of the 7 founders of the Starlight Legion? The line of runes describing the armor said that their names and faces were lost to time. The statue's missing head would certainly fit that description. The scavenger's echo suggested that the carapace monsters were cursed soldiers of the Fallen Legion. Was that Fallen Legion the Starlight Legion? The fact that he had received the Starlight armor after slaying a carapace centurion was almost a certain confirmation of that theory. If so, why were they cursed? Starless Void, Starlight Legion, what did all of it mean? The 7 heroes were described as being born in the all-consuming darkness. Their oath was to return light to the cursed land. What light did they seek? Starlight. And what was the nature of the all-consuming darkness? Was it the manifestation of the curse that befell their land? And if so, was it the same curse that eventually turned soldiers of the Starlight Legion into carapace monsters? If the curse was still around, was Sunny going to wake up one day with patches of chitin growing over his skin? What a creepy thought. The 7 heroes were forgotten, but the memory of their oath, apparently, still remained. On this forgotten shore, only Stell remembers. That was the Azure Blade's description. Was there a hidden meaning behind these words? Were the memories received on the forgotten shore hiding a secret? Inwardly, Sunny groaned. So many questions, and not a single answer. And then there was the main mystery, Cassie's vision, the one she chose to reveal to them. She dreamt of a boundless darkness locked behind 7 seals. Once the seals were broken, the darkness escaped. She also saw a crimson spire with 7 severed heads guarding 7 locks. Were these locks connected to the seals? And was the giant knight's missing head one of the 7 guarding them? Or was he completely wrong about everything, leaping to conclusions and forcing connections where none existed? Sunny sighed, knowing that his curiosity would not be quenched any time soon. He had too little information to make a proper theory. If so, there was no point in torturing himself right now. Maybe things would become clearer in the future. The word future made him frown. Chapter 57, Use of Weapons. In the evening, Sunny continued to practice with the sword under Neff's watchful eye. With his new insight, every movement felt different from before. After the 1,000 strikes were finished, he sat down to rest and studied the Azure Blade, tempted to continue obsessing over the abundant mysteries of the forgotten shore. After a while, Sunny asked, "Do you think I'm well-suited to use a sword? Should I consider switching weapons in the future?" Nephis shrugged. "That depends on your goals. However, the sword is considered to be the king of weapons for a reason." Sunny smiled. "And why is that?" She tilted her head and deliberated for a few seconds. Then she asked, "Do you know how natural selection works?" He raised an eyebrow. "Survival of the fittest. The strongest species survives." Changing Star glanced at him. "Somewhat correct. But actually, it's not the strongest species that survive. It's the most adaptable. Otherwise, lions and tigers and bears would have been the ones ruling the world instead of humans." Sunny knew about lions and bears from archival footage, but he had no idea what a tiger was. Probably another extinct predator. Meanwhile, Neff continued, not at all like her usual taciturn self. She seemed to be much more eloquent when talking about subjects she was confident in. The same logic can be applied to combat. A sword is not the most effective tool in every situation. A spear is more useful against enemies with long reach. A war hammer is much better against armor. A mace is easier to maintain. However, swords are the most versatile. She cast a gaze at the Azure Blade. A sword can pierce, it can cut, it can bash. It can be used effectively at a variety of ranges. It is swift and maneuverable. Every part of the sword from tip to pommel can be used to attack. While wielding a sword, you won't be the best at everything, but you'll be the most adaptable. Nephi's turned to him. Do you understand? Sunny thought for a bit before answering. I think I do. She gave him a nod and looked away. But in the end, you must remember one thing. It doesn't matter that much what's in your hands. A sword, a spear, a club, that's just tools. You are the weapon. He sighed and dismissed the azure blade. As always, Changing Star's lesson gave him a lot to think about. You are the weapon. He repeated it in his mind, feeling as though another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Together, they watched the sun set in comfortable silence. As the night approached, the sea was coming back, flooding the crimson labyrinth like a rush of darkness. Far below them, scavengers were scurrying to find a hiding place. A few of them were climbing the cliffs, hoping to spend the night on the small island. Sunny's shadow was keeping an eye on them. We're going to have guests soon, he said, disheartened at the thought that their short respite was about to end. Nephi sighed. That's all right. With the higher ground advantage, dealing with them won't be too hard. Sunny nodded and looked at the disappearing sun. Suddenly, his mood turned solemn. Doubt raised its ugly head, plunging his mind into the gloomy embrace of anxiety. Staring into the distance, Sunny hesitated and asked, Do you think we'll be able to reach that castle? She glanced at him, with no particular expression on her face. Yes. He turned to her and forced a smile. Why are you so sure? In the blood-red blaze of the sunset, Changing Star's calm eyes seemed to burn with heavenly fire. Looking west, she summoned her sword and answered. If that is our will, who dares to stop us? Dealing with the climbing scavengers, indeed, turned out to be comparatively easy. Sunny and Nephi's just had to ambush and push the bulky creatures off the cliff before they could find stable purchase. He received 4 shadow fragments practically for free, increasing the overall number to 32. Sadly, the soul shards couldn't be retrieved. They spent another day on the cliffs, resting and training. Sunny practiced with the sword while his shadow explored the nearby paths of the labyrinth. With the echo still recovering, their group was not in its optimal condition. That's why there was no point in hastily abandoning their current camp. However, very soon they were going to resume the journey west, moving from one height to another in hopes of reaching the mysterious human citadel. This time they were not going to travel without sufficient preparations. Knowing that a sudden storm can come at any moment, covering the world with darkness and summoning the sea back before sunset, the 3 sleepers decided to thoroughly scout a route before committing to moving their camp to the next landmark. Nephi spent the day meditating. Her eyes were closed. From time to time, it seemed as though a soft white glow was radiating from behind her eyelids. However, when Sunny looked closely, it was always gone, making him think that he was just imagining things. He suspected that Changing Star was training herself to endure the pain of her flaw. If so, he wished her luck. Cassie behaved like her usual self, being cheerful and friendly. It was as though their strange conversation had never happened. However, Sunny could feel that something about her was different. He couldn't quite put a finger on what exactly had changed about the blind girl, but she seemed to possess more resolve. It wasn't a bad thing. They spent some time chatting and remembering their time in the academy. Sunny told her about his lessons with teacher Julius and various strange things he had learned from the old man. Her reaction to the idea of studying dead languages of the dream realm was exactly the same as Sunny's initial protest and bewilderment. Soon the night was upon them again. This time, no scavenger tried to climb the cliffs, so Sunny and Nephi's could rest easy. However, they still slept in turns, keeping watch over the camp in case something unexpected happens. In the morning, they ate the last of the centurion's meat and prepared to climb down into the labyrinth. It was time to continue their journey. Chapter 58, Survival of the Fittest. Days later, Sunny was sitting on top of a dead scavenger, calmly cleaning the azure blood off his face. Your shadow grows stronger. His sword was still stuck between the plates of chitin armor, trembling slightly as the beast's body convulsed before falling still. Somewhere behind him, the sound of breaking carapaces announced that Nephis was already digging out soul shards from the corpses of the creatures they had slain. After dozens of such battles, the two of them were nothing if not efficient. Glancing back, he evaluated the scene of carnage. The path between two crimson walls was littered with corpses. Initially, they were simply planning to lure the carapace centurion that had been tracking them for the past few days into this narrow passage to turn its size against the monster. However, things quickly took a turn. Attracted by the noise of the battle, both the scavengers and the weird centipede creatures that were waging war against the carapace legion in this part of the labyrinth showed up to join the fight. In the ensuing mayhem, Sunny and Nephis used the animosity between the two tribes of monsters to their advantage and ended up as the only victors. Not far from him, the Echo was mutilating the corpse of the centurion. Its lost arm had long grown back. Now, the scavenger was tearing pieces of monster meat with its new pincer and vindictively devouring them. Technically, an Echo wasn't supposed to experience hunger. This one, however, had seemingly acquired a hatred for carapace centurions after their encounter with the massive scythe slayer on that fateful, stormy night. It had already been 2 weeks since they left the cliffs. In that time, many things had changed, while many remained the same. Moving from one high point to another, they steadily traveled west. With Cassie riding atop the Echo, the speed of the group was dramatically enhanced. Still, they took care to explore paths to their next stop before committing to a day-long journey. This way, the risk of being caught in another storm was minimized, as they could always either reach the next landmark in time or return to the previous one. Their approach to traveling through the labyrinth had also changed. In the past, Nephis and Sunny tried to avoid the scavengers, resorting to fighting them only if there was no other choice. However, the battle with the centurion opened their eyes to the fact that they desperately needed to become stronger and do it fast. That's why they began to actively hunt the carapace beasts, taking out any creatures that were either completely isolated or moving in groups of no more than 3. The idea of 2 sleepers consciously seeking out nightmare creatures of the awakened rank was pretty ridiculous, but somehow they made it work. Just as Nephis had said, both of them were abnormal. Clad in the Starlight Legion armor, Changing Star, who had always been an extremely formidable fighter, was now able to showcase the full extent of her combat ability. Simply put, she was a menace. It seemed as though her silver sword had a mind of its own. Whenever the tall figure in white armor appeared, rivers of azure blood were sure to flow. What's more, Neph's powers grew with each soul shard she consumed. Every increase was barely noticeable, but with dozens of them added up together, the difference was apparent. She was slowly approaching the line between the peak of human physical form and the threshold of superhuman prowess. The same could be said about Sunny, although, in his case, it was predicated on the timely use of the shadow. His own body had become considerably stronger due to the rigors of the dream realm, but it was still far away from reaching its peak potential. While Nephis was growing more powerful through the consumption of soul shards, he was quickly collecting shadow fragments. Of course, he wasn't able to get every kill, so their amount was less than that of the shards. But he also didn't have to share them with Cassie, which Changing Star was continuously doing. As the result, the rate of their progress was more or less the same. However, the slow accumulation of power was not the only factor that influenced the rapid growth of their combat effectiveness. Sunny's skill level and battle sense were also improving by leaps and bounds. Under the tutelage of sword goddess Nephis herself, he was quickly learning the ins and outs of wielding the blade. Then he was forced to apply these lessons to practice, participating in bloody battles each day with his life on the line. This brutal, merciless reality was, for better or worse, the best training grounds for a true fighter. There was no room for mistakes, only progress, because a single mistake would most likely become his last. One real fight was worth 1,000 hours of training. With experience, Sunny was able to gain knowledge. With clarity, he was able to turn this knowledge into a seed of understanding. But even that wasn't the biggest contributor to the dramatic increase in the group's overall might. The main culprit was, to his endless surprise, teamwork. After fighting side by side for so long, Sunny and Nephi's had developed a tacit, intuitive understanding. Without the need for words and signals, they were able to act in unison with each other, perfectly coordinating their attacks and actions to better control the battlefield and destroy their opponents. The importance of this unity was hard to overestimate. With proper cooperation, it was as though their numbers doubled. The effect was immediate and overwhelming, at least as long as they chose their battles carefully. It was nothing short of jolly. With all this added up together, their group had turned from a trio of lost kids into a cohort of well-equipped, experienced and battle-hardened survivors. Even Cassie was becoming stronger. Apart from the boost she had received from absorbing the soul shards, the blind girl was also slowly learning to live and function with her disability. After all, it was less than 2 months since she lost her sight. Cassie was still adapting to her condition, and she was doing an incredible job, considering the circumstances. She was still unable to help them fight against the monsters, but the burden of taking care of her was becoming less and less heavy. Sunny had also grown accustomed to it, even finding the time spent watching over the blind girl somewhat calming. The goal of reaching the human castle did not seem as impossible as it had before. And now, he felt as though they were getting closer and closer. Chapter 59, Shadow of the Crimson Spire. Jumping off the dead scavenger, Sunny retrieved his sword and whistled, letting Cassie know that it was safe to come out. Soon, she crawled out of a small opening in the coral wall and carefully put her feet on the ground. Leaning on her staff, the blind girl stood up and slightly turned her head, listening to the light sound of his footsteps. Sunny approached Cassie and took her hand, gently placing it on his shoulder. Then, carefully avoiding puddles of blood, he guided the blind girl to the echo. They talked on the way. Did those centipedes show up? During their journey through the labyrinth, they discovered that the scavengers were not the only creatures populating it. Different types of monsters lived in the Crimson Forest, hiding inside the reefs during the night and coming out to hunt once the sun was up. There were sentient colonies of carnivorous worms that attacked from beneath the black mud, flesh-eating flowers that strangled their prey with blood-sucking vines, and weird, transparent tentacles that they had once seen dragging a desperately resisting scavenger into a dark, cavernous crevice. They still didn't know what type of creature had been hiding in the crevice. Sunny hoped that they would never find out. In short, the labyrinth was home to all kinds of horrors, every one of them at least of the awakened rank. They were all carrion eaters, living off the remains left behind by the monsters of the dark sea. Given the opportunity, they were also more than willing to devour each other, not to mention the 3 juicy humans. Luckily, the Carapace Legion turned out to be extremely territorial and seemed to have the upper hand in this region of the Crimson Reef. While their armor, size, and physical strength made the scavengers formidable opponents, dealing mostly with one type of creature was infinitely better than constantly facing unknown danger. The centipede monsters were the latest enemy of the Carapace Legion they had met. Some of these critters were more than 3 meters long, with glistening red chitin and hundreds of tiny, scurrying legs. They were abhorrently fast and agile, being able to move through mud, climb the coral walls, and even drop on the unsuspecting victims from above with incredible speed. What's worse, their bodies were able to secrete a corrosive black oil that melted through the strongest armor in seconds. The only redeeming quality of the centipede monsters was that their chitin shells weren't very tough and could be easily pierced by a sword. Sunny answered without turning back. Yeah, 6 of them, and a few scavengers too. We let them fight each other and then finished off the survivors. Cassie gulped. Were you hurt? Nothing our armor couldn't handle. What about the centurion? He glanced at the half-devoured carcass and smiled. It's not going to bother us again. This was the second awakened monster they had slain after entering the dream realm. Compared to the first encounter, this battle went much smoother. No one died, no one was seriously injured. The Echo even kept both of its pincers. How many soul shards did we get? Sunny counted. Should be 11. Now it was Cassie's turn to smile. That's our biggest haul so far, by a lot. He nodded. Yeah. However, they had once again failed to receive a memory. Sunny wasn't sure if his bad luck was to blame, but neither he nor Nephi's had been able to acquire a single one for the past 2 weeks. It was almost as though the spell had decided that they had already gotten enough. There can never be enough. He sighed. One of the games he and Cassie liked to play during camp was to discuss what they would buy after coming back to the real world and becoming rich. However, he had to collect a few memories to auction off first. Otherwise, where would the money come from? Consumed by greed and avarice, Sunny approached the Echo and looked up at it with disapproval. Hey you, stop chewing. The scavenger obediently froze, a piece of meat still hanging from its mouth. Spit it out. Shaking his head, Sunny helped Cassie climb to her seat and handed her the reins. This weirdo actually gobbled up almost half of the centurion. What's up with that? Of all the Echoes in the world, why did I have to get stuck with a defective one? His shadow solemnly nodded, expressing that it completely understood his sentiment. Sunny squinted at it. What a rare show of solidarity. The shadow didn't have any Echoes, though. What defective individual was it stuck with? Cheeky bastard. Cassie laughed. Don't badmouth my steed. He is a great Echo. I like him very much. It's a he now, huh? Sunny shook his head again and got to stripping the remaining meat off the centurion's carcass. Then, he placed the meat into the seaweed saddlebags attached to the scavenger. He had made these bags himself to increase the group's carrying capacity. After all, the scavenger was supposed to be extremely strong. Not using it to their advantage would have been an oversight. After that, Sunny sighed and got to the least pleasant task, harvesting the oil sacs from the centipede monster's corpses. Each had 2 of them, connected to a special gland. The whole process was more disgusting than dangerous, since the corrosive effect was only achieved after the liquids from the 2 sacs were mixed. They had not come up with a way to utilize the centipede oil yet, but Nephi's insisted on collecting as much of it as possible. She was sure that it was going to be of use one day. At the very least, the oil was highly flammable. Speaking of Nephi's, by the time Sunny was done collecting the sacks, she had already gathered all the soul shards and was standing in front of the Echo. He showed her his trophies and carefully placed them in a separate saddlebag. All done. She nodded. Sunny looked at the sky, trying to determine the time. The sun was right above them, high in the gray sky. There was still plenty of daytime left. What do you think? We're right in between the flat hill and the Bone Ridge. Should we return or try to reach the ridge today? The ground level of the labyrinth was not uniform. Some parts of it were situated higher than the others. Currently, they were in one such area. The dark sea was much more shallow here, which meant that there were more natural features that remained above water during the night. That made for shorter distance between them. Nephi's thought for a bit, then said, Let's push to the Bone Ridge. They had already scouted most of the way to it yesterday, so there wasn't much danger of getting lost in the labyrinth and not making it on time. With the carapace centurion dead, the unpredictable element that had been making their lives harder for these past few days was also gone. Considering this, changing Star's decision seemed proper. Sunny nodded. Okay. With that, he sent his shadow forward. Sometime later, they were approaching the Bone Ridge. The sun was preparing to set, but there was still enough time to get to safety. Sunny, however, felt alarmed and uncomfortable. This feeling began to pursue him soon after they had left the cliffs. It always appeared close to the evening and persisted until the last minutes of the sunset, then disappeared, leaving him puzzled and uneasy. The further west they traveled, the stronger the feeling became. It was as though something was not quite right with the world during that time. But no matter how hard Sunny tried to understand what that wrongness was, he couldn't. In the end, he decided to share his uneasiness with the group. After listening to him, the girls were surprised. It seemed that they did not notice anything strange. Even Cassie, whose affinity to revelations provided her with an incredible intuition, didn't experience the strange feeling. However, she did suggest a theory. Since Sunny was the only one susceptible to the feeling, it was logical to assume that there was something unique about him that made it possible. And the only difference he had from the girls in terms of perception was his shadow sense. Which meant that the source of the wrongness, most likely, had something to do with the behavior of shadows. Guided by her advice, Sunny was finally able to understand the reason for his discomfort. As it turns out, Cassie was right in the hours closest to sunset, when the sun was hanging low in the western skies. A vast shadow moved through the labyrinth, affecting his senses and making his skin crawl. The shadow was too distant and colossal to be seen, but he could still feel its presence. When he told Cassie about the immense shadow, she nodded, as though it explained everything. Then she said, "That is the shadow of the Crimson Spire." Chapter 60, Bone Ridge. Back then, it took him a couple of seconds to realize what she was talking about. "The spire from your vision, the one with 7 seals." Cassie nodded. "Yes, in my dream it seemed to be as tall as a mountain. I could even see it from the walls of the human castle, looming in the distance like a crimson spear piercing the skies. When the sun sets, the spire's vast shadow falls over the castle and stretches east, as far as you can see." She was silent for a moment, then added, "The feeling I got when looking at the Crimson Spire was very similar to what you had described, only much more intense." Sunny frowned, trying to remember the exact words Cassie had used to describe her vision. 7 severed heads guarding 7 seals, a dying angel being devoured by hungry shadows, feeling of extreme terror and loss. What was the deal with that spire, exactly? Is it crimson because it's made out of the same stuff as the labyrinth? The crimson coral surrounding them was not, in fact, coral. It's just what they called it based on some resemblance, for the sake of simplicity. The actual nature of the strange material remained a mystery. Cassie hesitated. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the labyrinth is made from the same stuff as the spire. In other words, the Crimson Spire might have been the source of all this madness. Still, it was just a theory. There was too little information to confirm it. However, Sunny did feel that the spire was, in one way or another, at the center of all things that they had encountered. He just hoped that it wouldn't be their final destination. Knowing the reason behind his restlessness, Sunny was able to endure it much better. He even found a hidden benefit to this situation. As long as he sensed the shadow of the Crimson Spire, he could pinpoint the direction to the human castle, since it was situated somewhere between their location and the source of the shadow. In a sense, the Crimson Spire had become his inner compass. "Get ready." Neff's voice took Sunny out of his reverie. Shaking off the distracting thoughts, he focused on the task at hand. They were getting close to the Bone Ridge. This name came to their minds as soon as they had first laid their eyes on this towering landmark. It was visible from quite a distance, sharply contrasted against the crimson coral and the gray sky in all its ivory splendor. The Bone Ridge was, in fact, made of bone. The skeletal remains of a colossal sea monster lay on an enormous mound of chaotically growing coral, with its arching spine protruding especially high above the ground. It was impossible to say what the terrifying creature had looked like while it was still alive, but one thing was certain. It was gargantuan even by the standards of the Dark Sea. This wasn't the first giant skeleton they saw during their journey. In fact, the labyrinth was littered with remains of dead leviathans, their massive bones forming natural arches and palaces throughout it. They were easy to spot because the coral formations were especially tall and dense in their vicinity, as though trying to bury any sign of whiteness in the sea of crimson. Sunny, however, had a feeling that the situation was actually reversed. To him, it seemed as though the coral was actually growing out of the old bones and spreading in every direction, slowly consuming the world. When he looked at the crimson mounds surrounding the colossal remains, he couldn't help but see them as rivers of ancient, solidified blood. He was almost sure that if they were to dig deep enough into the black mud to find the roots of the crimson forest, they would find nothing but endless layers of bones. What a scary image. Regardless of what Sonny thought about the nature of the labyrinth, the beast whose remains formed the bone ridge was especially large. Thanks to that, a portion of its long spine was tall enough to remain above the water during the night. That's why they had chosen it as the next stop on their journey. With the evening approaching, the next task was crucial. They had to scale the dead Leviathan and make sure that no other creature had decided to take shelter in its remains. If something did, they had no choice but to try and kill it, since there was no time to retreat to their previous safe haven. The last step was often the riskiest. Coming to the base of the coral mound, the group moved around it, searching for a convenient path up. Eventually, they arrived in front of the creature's cracked, misshapen skull. With its lower jaw missing or buried under the mud, the upper formed a vast, cavernous cave. Feeling shivers running down his spine, Sonny passed beneath the terrifying palisade of teeth and entered the cave. With his shadow leading the way, they made way to the back of the creature's skull and soon entered the hollow expanse of its spine. Inside the spine, the bone surface under their feet was as wide as a road. Actually, it looked a lot like a highway running through a long tunnel, with stark beams of light falling through the gaps between the massive vertebrae. The tunnel was inclined upward, most of its length hidden behind the bend of the ceiling. When the echo entered the spine, its chitin legs produced a loud, echoing clatter. Nephi's grimaced. Any movement? Sonny checked with the shadow and shook his head. Changing Star looked forward and slightly lowered her chin. Let's proceed. Despite the fact that the shadow had not noticed any danger, they still summoned their swords before moving forward. It was not their first time being ambushed at the edge of safety. Luckily, their precautions turned out to be unnecessary. Nothing was hiding inside the gargantuan remains, so they were able to reach the highest point of the spine without having to cut their way through an unknown number of monsters. By the time they got to safety, the sun was already setting. The dark sea was returning, filling the inside of the sea monster's spine with the echoing sound of rushing water. Sonny took the saddlebags off the echo and dismissed it, making their camp instantly feel much roomier. All three of them were in desperate need of a bath. Leaving the girls alone to give them an opportunity to wash themselves, Sonny walked some distance away and sat down, letting his tired body rest. His shadow returned to the lower parts of the spine, watching the black, dim water slowly rise and devour the ivory whiteness. He had to make sure that nothing would crawl out of the water at the last minute. With half of his mind preoccupied with observing the rising tide, the other half was free to wander. Sonny summoned the runes and checked the number of shadow fragments in his possession. Shadow fragments, 96/1000. Not bad, he only had 12 at the beginning of all this. In less than a month, the amount increased dramatically. He was stronger and faster now. He was also more experienced. However, that still left him far inferior to even the weakest nightmare creatures of the Forgotten Shore in terms of raw physical might, even with the help of the shadow. How long before I'm able to wrestle a scavenger with my bare hands? The answer was pretty obvious, not to mention extremely disappointing. Not before his own shadow core had awakened, which could only happen after returning to the real world. Sonny sighed. Soon it was his turn to wash. Taking the bottle of endless water from refreshed, rosy Cassie, he walked back to his secluded spot and dismissed the Pupitor's shroud. A cold breeze touched his pale skin, making Sonny shiver. He looked down, shaking his head at the amount of dirt, sweat, and dried blood that was covering his body. Being an awakened was not the cleanest of professions. While he was washing up, Nephi's used the remaining time before nightfall to make a fire and cook some meat. These days, they even had salt to season it. At first, the idea of using the sea salt left behind by the dark sea did not seem very appealing, but after a while, they grew accustomed to it. Salt made every meal they had much tastier. They ate in silence, too hungry and tired to talk. Soon it was time to sleep. Sunny took the first watch, planning to fit in some sword practice before it was his turn to rest. Going through the motions of the basic kata, he split his mind in two. One part was concentrating on the movements of his body, while the other, smaller part, was observing the surface of the black water through his shadow. In the absence of wind, the dark circle covering the lower part of the spine was strangely calm. This was his first time seeing the black water without the constant undulation of waves, with its surface strangely flat and absolutely still. It looked like a giant mirror, one that was made of pure darkness. It was unnaturally mesmerizing. Suddenly, he felt a strong desire to come closer and take a look at his reflection. However, Sunny didn't move. He was terrified of what might